A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
In 7th grade, my Spanish class was what you'd expect, a mix of awkwardness and the laughter of preteens. But there was something about the way Mr. Alvarez ran the room that made it different. He had this peculiar method that made me both curious and uneasy. Every day, he'd use a cup filled with popsicle sticks, each labeled with a student's name, to call on kids for answers, and each time I watched how he'd dig his fingers into that cup, shuffling the sticks like a dealer in a card game, there was a creeping sensation snaking its way up my spine. The first time I heard my name called, I felt a jolt of anxiety thrumming through my veins, and while most classmates would mutter occasional groans when chosen, I never minded. I was determined to prove myself. But one Thursday morning, as he turned his back to draw a stick, I suddenly experienced an overwhelming urge, a combination of mischief and rebellion, to reach into that cup. Knowing no one was watching, I inched my fingers towards the wooden sticks, feeling them cool against my skin like marrow plunging into ice, and fished out an extra stick. It felt off, slightly hotter than it should have been, but I shoved it into my backpack as Mr. Alvarez announced who he called, blissfully unaware of the secrecy unfolding in those last moments of innocence. Just as the day lingered towards the end, a gnawing curiosity prompted me to take another peek. Feeling the popsicle stick beneath my fingers, I took it out. It was elegantly carved, and embossed into the wood was the faint silhouette of a screaming face, painfully contorted, and for a brief instant, my heart stalled. The next day, as unusual noises filled the classroom, distant hollers and stretching whispers, I decided to show my friend Leah. She gasped, eyes widening in a mix of disbelief and fright when I revealed the stick, and as I told her how I had stolen it, her brows furrowed deeply, but I brushed it off, declaring it was just a harmless trinket from the school. Still, Leah grew more uneasy, insisting that I put it back, but I dismissed her worries, feeling a strange sense of power as the stick sat proudly in my backpack. Days passed, and soon things began to shift. Mr. Alvarez's usual smile faded into something more severe, more brooding. When he turned the sticks to pick names, he'd glance into the abyss of the cup for what felt like endless moments, as if asking it for something. One afternoon while my peers shot paper at each other during lunch, the fire alarm blared, slicing through the humdrum chatter. I bolted up, heart racing. We filed outside into the freezing winter air but found ourselves lingering longer than expected. My heart plummeted when I spotted Mr. Alvarez standing alone in the doorway to the building, staring outside as if he was watching something that was only visible to him. A chill crawled down my spine. I could see tension in his shoulders. Then, he abruptly turned and descended inside, leaving us in hushed confusion. The back of my mind began to itch, questions swirling like a tornado. Why was he ignoring us? That was the same day the whispers started. Only a few classmates mentioned it at first, but soon they snowballed into panicked conversations. Fights erupted in the hallways, students claiming they had seen shadowy figures lurking near the gymnasium, students going missing. I felt trapped inside my own skin. I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that the popsicle stick was somehow linked to everything that was happening. The next week, instead of ignoring what I had done, I asked Leah to come over after school to perform what I thought was a benign séance, just a silly teenage diversion to test our nerves. But the moment we lit candles around my room, she clutched my arm, eyes wild with terror, warning me that she had a bad feeling. As I called out to whatever spirits were listening, Leah went pale. The candlelight flickered with a gust that seemed too deliberate, too purposeful, until suddenly the curtain flew open, and a voice scratched against our minds, warning us to stop. It told us that the popsicle stick held a curse, that taking it was not merely a childish act. I panicked and threw it, the carving catching the bright glow as it clattered across the floor, but by that point, it felt too late. Week after week, I watched as classmates started disappearing, their names plucked from Mr. Alvarez's cup like sickly sweetness, their faces fading from memory as if they had never existed at all. The day Leah was called, I felt the panic fire up my throat, desperation clawing under my skin. When her name was framed by the popsicle stick, she turned to me, eyes pleading, and the realization hit me like 1,000 knives. Each stick was not just taken to be called on, it was a debt, and once called, the name would vanish. It struck me harder when I replayed the sentence whispered to us during the séance. The popsicle sticks were anchors of the lost souls, cursed to feed on the currency of children's lives. In horror, I watched as Leah stood, walking over to Mr. Alvarez, who seemed transfixed, but I couldn't speak, couldn't scream. I felt chained by the weight of my own dread and realization. All thoughts crumbled as I witnessed her turn to look back at me one last time, her face frozen in terror, and just like that, She was gone, another name erased from our collective memory, and the popsicle stick that once bore her identity lay abandoned in the cup. I froze in disbelief, and came to understand the true horror as Mr. Alvarez's eyes fell on me, suddenly glinting with a predator's satisfaction. He reached for another stick but paused, a slow smirk creeping onto his face, and I was certain he already knew my name. I was next, the sole survivor in this game of ravenous spirits, desperately clinging onto a borrowed moment in time, aware now that I had unearthed a darkness that belonged far beneath the surface, just waiting for a soul brave enough or foolish enough to take a single stick. I'm not proud of what I did that night, and as I sit here, blankets pulled tightly around me in this dimly lit room, the weight of my actions weighs heavy on my chest, suffocating me with each breath. It started when I decided to take a walk after a long week, the kind of stroll meant to clear your head but only led me deeper into the labyrinth of my own thoughts, contemplating my dreary existence as I passed by flickering streetlights. That's when I saw her, huddled near an alleyway, her long hair tangled and matted, skin pale and hollowed, yet there was a raw beauty about the girl, probably barely 20, with eyes that seemed to flicker with a hint of life despite her circumstance. Her name was Kelly, and though her clothes were ragged and her body trembled from the cold, she somehow managed to smile at me with a warmth that shocked my conscience back to life. I stopped, heart racing, curiosity battling the moral lessons ingrained in me, and before I knew it, I was engaged in a conversation with her, her soft voice contrasting sharply with the harsh edge of her world. She recounted stories of loss, betrayal, and the harsh realities of surviving on the streets, eliciting a strange mix of admiration and pity in me, and as I spoke to her, sharing tales of my own mundane struggles, I felt an absurd connection to this girl who had nothing. Somewhere in the bleakness of that alley, between the verses of her sad life, I found myself becoming enchanted, my heart racing under the illusion of a twisted romance, as we laughed and shared secrets unfit for our surroundings. I was lost in the moment as her hand grazed mine, and despite the growing ache of conscience, a darker urge began to bubble within. She leaned closer, and the space between us crackled with an electric tension. She said she needed help, and in an impulsive moment of weakness, I made a string of terrible decisions that led us to my car parked a few blocks down. The cramped space became charged, her presence overwhelming, the smell of stale cigarettes and unwashed clothes mixed with something raw and primal in the air. I could hear the sirens wailing in the distance, but the urgency of the moment drowned it out as she leaned in, whispering softly, and I could feel the allure of my desires clash violently with my ethics. As I surrendered to the primal instinct feeding the shadowy depths of my mind, I suddenly became hyper-aware of the risk, the fleeting thrill of the taboo feeling exhilarating, intoxicating, dangerously inviting. One moment, I was just a man, and the next, I had been reborn into something darker as she knelt before me, and I was helpless against the allure of the situation. There, in the confinement of my car, morality and reality blurred, tugging at my chest as I lost myself in the forbidden act, revulsion battling with exhilaration, leaving a taste so bitter and sweet it nearly consumed me whole. And yet, as the might of shame washed over me afterward like a tidal wave, I realized the girl was simply a fragment of my own delusions, a vessel to challenge my values, and I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that I had done more than just indulge in a moment of weakness. I had violated the very humanity I claimed to uphold. After it was over, her eyes held something I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mix of gratitude for the fleeting escape I had given her and a deeper sorrow for the life she had led and a life she knew would not allow her a better end. She slipped out of my car like a ghost, her silhouette merging into the shadows of the streets, and I was left staring at the vacant passenger seat, my blood still raging against the fraying edges of my morality, paralyzed by the haunting vision of her now faded smile and the whispered implications of my choices. I drove home in a daze, the streets transformed into a blur of red lights and darkened corners where I imagined other souls may be lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness to ensnare those naive enough to cross their paths. Now, the silence of my room has been shattered by the chorus of my mistakes echoing in my mind, and I can't stop replaying that night like a broken record, the details sharp and clear, her laughter, her touch, the focus of my desires, the contemplation of a life I will never fully understand. I know that I should feel no remorse in the darkness, that somewhere she was still out there, yet the shadows cast by my actions loom larger than life, breeding something ugly in the fertile soil of my regret. The girl I almost saved has transformed into a specter who haunts my conscience, feeding a gnawing dread that leaves me reeling in guilt, wanting to seek redemption but fearing that the real horror might lie waiting in the alleyways, mirrored back at me in the faces of all those I ignore every day. Now, as I sit here, trembling with the weight of my decisions, I can't help but wonder if after that night, I still have the right to look anyone in their eyes, Or if I'd become the reflection of all that I despise, a thoughtless monster lurking beneath the surface, masked by the guise of a moral man, driven by instincts I thought had long been buried but now dance menacingly just out of reach. I have a secret, and it's not the kind of secret you can shake off easily. It's more like a shadow constantly stalking me, growing longer during the day until it envelopes everything in its path. It started innocently enough when I was a teenager, an idle fascination that morphed into an unsettling obsession. I couldn't help it, it was like my eyes had developed a mind of their own, drawn to the bulges of men regardless of whether I was in a grocery store, a crowded subway, or even at work. At first, I thought maybe it was just my hormones, the rites of teenage passage whispering cruel secrets about what it meant to be attracted to someone. But then it spiraled. I'd see a hint of something in tight jeans, the outline of a body that sent shivers down my spine, and before I knew it, I was caught in a web of inappropriate stares and lingering glances, entwined deep in the thrill of it all. I tried to control myself, eye contact, conversation, whatever I could to overload my senses before succumbing to the urge to look. It was easy to brush it off as harmless curiosity until the day I met Caleb. He moved in next door, a charismatic smile that lit up the entire street and those sweatpants that fit like a second skin. My gaze kept flitting to him, my heart racing with some primal instinct as I watched him weave through his garden, muscles rippling, self-assured. One afternoon, I caught him lifting weights in his backyard, the sunlight glistening on his skin, and my breath hitched. I remembered scolding myself silently, trying to focus on the flowers I was supposed to be tending but failing gloriously. That was the first time I heard the whispering, almost like it was creeping out from my subconscious. "Just look one more time," it taunted, a voice that didn't belong to me yet resonated deep within. Eager to please, my gaze was drawn like a moth to a flame, but I felt a wave of resistance wash over me. I took a few steps back, wanting to run away from this overwhelming tide of embarrassment and desire. But I couldn't. My hands were trembling as I tried to cover my reckless thoughts, and as I turned to bolt, a sudden chill washed over me. Caleb had caught me staring. The look in his eyes told me that he knew. Mortified, I fled back inside, shutting the door behind me as if it could block out my shame. Hours turned into days, a cycle of constant hiding from this man I barely knew, and yet my obsession with him intensified, leaving me no choice but to keep checking, even when I was out with friends. It turned into a game of desperation. I'd pretend to be interested in the bar scene, feigning conversations while secretly scanning the crowd for any hint of pleasing anatomy, hearts quickening, breaths catching. I rationalized it, telling myself that nothing bad could come out of this fixation, that it was just a phase. Yet, this was no ordinary obsession. It felt more sinister, like there was a force behind it pushing me, urging me into darkness. Then one night, after too many drinks, I stumbled home, my head spinning with more than just booze. In the dim light of my living room, I caught sight of Caleb through our window. He was bent over in his kitchen, and I froze, blood roaring in my ears. I leaned closer, the world around me fading, and a really horrible urge washed over me to take it further. This compulsion pushed me to check my phone's camera, and I took a picture, my breath caught in my throat as I snapped the image without hesitation, the screen lighting my face under the dark cloak of night. What had I just done? My hands shook as I deleted the photo, panic coursing through me. I knew I had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. The next day, I saw Caleb in the hallway, and I felt different, I felt changed. I was bracing myself, expecting anger, judgment, but he just smiled, his eyes boring into mine. That's when I sensed the shift. I couldn't ignore the feeling that he knew something, that he could see through my facade. I could hardly breathe, embarrassment mingled with a strange thrill coursing through me. I made excuses to avoid him, but I could see him watching me, those eyes lingering way too long, the corners of his mouth teasing upward in an unsettling way. It wasn't just my infatuation that heightened, something darker was unfolding, and I was caught in the middle of it. It became a relentless cycle. Despite my efforts to keep my gaze in check, I found myself staring more and more, addicted to the thrill of the chase. If I looked just long enough, if I lingered just until he caught me, maybe I would finally feel free. But even as I reveled in the rush, I could feel something sinister under the surface. My dreams became haunted by images of him, twisted fantasies that left me terrified to sleep. It felt too real, a manifestation of my longing that transformed the mundane into the vile. I fled into the arms of distraction, binge-watching, late-night runs, but it only grew worse. My friends noticed, concerned whispers chased me as I bogged myself down with work, yet they never understood the dark thrill of sensation I chased. Then came the day when I found a small, folded note slipped under my door. It was simple, a piece of paper stained with black ink. "I see you." My heart dropped, dread crept into my mind, and for the third time that week, I was caught staring out the window watching Caleb. He sat there with his back to me, a casual posture, but something about the stillness felt wrong. I knew I had to confront this madness, to reach some clarity beyond this depravity, so I knocked on his door. When he opened it, there were no judgments in his gaze, but something even worse, a predatory glint that coiled around my gut like a serpent. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just playing an innocent game anymore. I had sparked something dark in him, reflected my own obsessions. He leaned in closer, breath hot against my ear. I could hardly hear the words, a whisper more like a slither. "Coated in poison honey. Why don't you come in? We can make this easier." Terror seized my heart as it dawned on me I had become the object of someone else's fixation, and in that moment, I realized, it wasn't just the bulges that had ensnared me. It was the madness I had beckoned, a sinister twist of fate that bound us together. I turned and fled, feeling his laughter echo behind me, taunting and chilling, and I knew I could never outrun the shadows of my own design. I went to the doctor today, and paid with cash. I'm pregnant. I've always been one of those women who was certain that I didn't want kids. I enjoy my freedom too much, the spontaneous weekends, the carefree lifestyle where my biggest concern is catching up on sleep before Monday rolls around. But that all changed the moment I noticed the missed period, followed by nausea that hit like a freight train. At first, I figured it was just stress from work piling up, but deep down, I knew, I was pregnant. The gnawing panic set in when I bought a pregnancy test. I desperately scribbled down a fake name when the cashier raised an eyebrow, but there was no hiding from the reality of those two pink lines. It was a Friday, and I made an appointment for the earliest slot on Monday. My mind raced while I sat in the waiting room, the sterile smell of disinfectant hanging in the air, mingling with the anxious murmurs of patients. I pulled out cash from an envelope in my purse, willing myself to stay calm, but as I handed it over, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The nurse gave me a warm smile, but as she led me into the examination room, her eyes flickered with something unsettling. Was it pity? It felt wrong. As the doctor entered, he was brusque, almost too businesslike, with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. He reviewed my chart, nodding as he took a seat. "Well, congratulations, you're definitely pregnant," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I nodded, fighting the instinct to run. But then he hesitated, glancing at the door for a second too long before turning back to me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Have you experienced any unusual symptoms?" I was taken aback momentarily. Unusual? What did that even mean? Sure, I was tired and moody, but who wouldn't be? I shrugged it off, thinking he was just trying to check off a box, but he pressed further. "Any cravings? Visual disturbances?" My heart raced. Wasn't this just an appointment to confirm what I already knew? Then, before I could answer, he leaned over and said something that chilled me to the bone. "It's important to be honest with me." I felt my stomach lurch as thoughts of what unusual could mean flooded my mind. Was I having complications? What did he know? Anxiety sizzled in my veins until I barely heard my own voice as I muttered what little I could about feeling nauseous. But then he asked, "What about dreams?" It was such an odd question that my hesitation felt like a weight. My dreams had grown increasingly vivid, bleeding into reality. I'd awakened in cold sweats, terrified from visions that felt too real. I hesitated too long, sensing my pulse thundering in my ears, and he seemed to notice. "It's crucial that we understand what's happening inside of you," he insisted. With his eyes locked on mine, I began to tremble. "Sometimes," I started shakily, "I dream of A." But it felt impossible to finish. The words caught in my throat as a recognition washed over me. I didn't want to admit it, because these weren't normal dreams, they were visions, filled with whispers and shadowy figures whose faces I couldn't make out but whose hands reached for me, beckoning me to follow. "A child?" He leaned in as though the word had power, his voice dropping. "Yes, many women find that their dreams do change. Sometimes carrying a child can open certain doors." The room felt colder as a shiver danced along my spine. I thought of a dark figure looming in the night, of the eyes that glinted with mischief and intent, and with a shaky breath, I shook my head vigorously. No, I refused to believe that, despite the strange occurrences, strange shadows flitting across my peripheral vision during daylight, or the feeling of being watched as I walked through the dark corners of my apartment. Panic gripped my heart as I left the appointment, ignoring the whispers of unease clawing at my mind. convinced that it was just a scary phase of pregnancy and not something more sinister. But the thought of normality faded quickly. I was on the subway when it hit me. Every woman's pregnancy is unique, and mine seemed to be unraveling threads of reality. I could have sworn I heard muffled cries, hushed voices echoing around me, weaving tales I couldn't decipher. The tension built within me as days turned into nights, each slumber filled with horrors, hands tugging me back, visions of a nursery draped in shadows, and the feeling that I was not alone, that something was sharing my space. I went back to the doctor after a few weeks, unable to bear the questioning heaviness anymore, but when I arrived, something was off. The weight of dread pressed upon me as I braced myself for what felt like an eternity, anticipating the worst, and yet that familiar chill washed through me when I found the office closed, the lights dimmed. Panic rose within me as I knocked, the sound echoing back ominously. Finally, a janitor appeared, his expression unreadable. "He's not here today," he said, and before I even processed his words, he glanced at me oddly, as if appraising something just beyond my grasp. "I can take a message." My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't even comprehend how many layers of wrong spun around me. I bolted home, the city blurring around me, my feet barely touching the ground, as if little tethers attached me to the menacing force looming in the backdrop. Over the following weeks, I avoided looking in mirrors, too afraid that whatever lurked within my dreams would spill over, that I'd see something staring back at me, something not quite human, but with laughter echoing in the recesses of my mind. I could hardly sleep. I became a shadow of myself, a hollow shell full of dread that the closer I came to the due date, the more surreal my world became until I received an anonymous letter, slipped beneath my door. "The child may also be hungry." I felt like I'd been hit by a bus. I could barely think as fear clawed at my gut, twisting and coiling as I frantically searched for answers. Was I really pregnant? Was there something dark growing within me, feeding on this twisting nightmare? I had to know. Unable to quell the rising chaos inside my head, I returned to the clinic one last time, propelled by instinct. This time, the door swung open, but it was empty. Glassy-eyed like a ghost town, the air was thick with silence. "Hello?" I called, heart pounding, but my voice fell flat against the oppressive quiet. Almost instinctively, I pushed through the door to the examination room, catching a glimpse of the doctor standing there, his back turned to me. "We need to talk," he said matter-of-factly, turning slowly. His face was blank, but I could see shadows shifting just beyond, bodies moving in the corners of the room, asking me to join them. The dreamlike quality enveloped me until I felt weightless before him. "You have to understand, it's not the same," he murmured, the distortion of his voice echoed strangely within the walls. I stared into his eyes, desperate for clarity. "What have you done?" I gasped, feeling bile rise in my throat. "What is happening to me?" And as he stepped closer, a cruel smile creeping across his lips, the air shifted, breathing a chilling darkness into my lungs. That empty, hunger-wrought gaze pierced through me, igniting the truth I'd tried to ignore. "You paid with cash, but you didn't pay the full price. There's always a cost, my dear." As the world swirled around me, I realized this was no longer about me. I was merely a vessel for whatever dark entity grew within, hungry for something I didn't understand and couldn't escape. I could feel it stirring, a primal entity feeding off my fear, waiting for the moment it would break free from the fragile shell I had so foolishly called my body. And in that moment, I knew with stark clarity, deep down, I wasn't just pregnant, I was carrying the embodiment of a nightmare, and once it was ready, it would come to collect its due, for the door had been opened, and there was no going back. I never imagined my day would spiral into a nightmare just because I forgot to lock my bathroom door. The chain of events started innocently enough when I left my apartment for the first time in weeks, both anxious and excited to find the right real estate agent to help me sell my place. I'd gone through a rough patch recently, loss of my job, and subsequently, a deep financial hole I needed to crawl out of, and the idea of leaving my little sanctuary after years of solitude sent a tingle of dread down my spine, so I promised myself I'd be careful. After a morning researching agents online, I scheduled an appointment with Sarah, a promising young real estate agent known for her thrilling social media posts and an impressive list of recent sales. I met her in the lobby of my building, her blonde hair perfectly slicked back, a professional demeanor cloaking what I guessed was a truly vibrant personality. She reassured me that everything was going to be okay as she ushered me into my apartment, but I felt an undercurrent of anxiety when it hit me. I hadn't tidied up after my frantic week of hibernation. As we stepped inside, the familiar scent of stale air greeted me while remnants of my last meal lay unwashed, scattered in the sink. I motioned for her to start, but I couldn't help feeling uncomfortable. The pent-up dread weighed heavily, making my skin crawl with self-awareness. Sarah seemed unfazed, though, and began discussing the potential of my living space. Her client, a young couple who had just begun peering down the hallway from 2 floors up, wrapped in with anticipation outside the door, and I could sense that future buyers were gathering intrigued in their minds. I turned to pour myself a glass of water but was interrupted by a sudden commotion. My bathroom door swung wide open, and before I realized it, I was standing completely naked behind a half-open door that separated my shared space from my hidden refuge. The couple, whom I'd only seen on videos scrolling through social media, gasped in disbelief, but only momentarily. Their shock turned to bewilderment before they averted their eyes, laughter echoing off faux wood floors as I bolted to cover my nakedness, grabbing a nearby throw blanket in a panic. Sarah's face twisted between shock and humor as she quickly ushered them out after the initial surprise wore off, and all I could hear as I stood there trembling was the sound of my own heartbeat thrumming loudly against my eardrums as I debated whether I should just disappear into the ground right then and there. Everything about that moment felt surreal, as I felt like I had turned into some absurd character in a sitcom wrongfully scripted to reflect my real-life embarrassment. I wrapped the blanket tighter around me, pacing my apartment like a trapped animal, consumed by shame. But it didn't stop there. As Sarah returned, the glint in her eyes suggested something uncomfortably thrilling had occurred, a spark of excitement from unfolding drama. I avoided her gaze, but she seemed to sense my vulnerability, telling me that it happened more often than I might think, in a world that pushed the boundaries of personal space, where privacy had become an elusive concept. But there was something more unsettling in her tone, a hint of amusement that made my skin prickle again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that being forgotten was the least of my concerns because in the haze of my humiliation, something sinister lurked in the back of my mind. Days turned into weeks, and somehow, I figured that everyone had probably forgotten about the disastrous walk-in, but then late one night, I heard something odd, faint thumping against my apartment door that reverberated through the walls, an uncomfortable reminder of all that had transpired. I opened the door cautiously, only to find a crumpled note wedged into the doorway, penned in an aggressive yet familiar scrawl, "We aren't done yet." It rattled me to my core, the chill crawling down my spine intensifying as I reflected back on the enigma that enveloped Sarah and the couple. I hadn't thought twice about the whispers I heard trailing behind them during our next exchanges, but clearly, I hadn't considered someone might be keeping tabs on my every move. Was I being targeted for failure, or was it just a sick joke strung along from that embarrassing moment? The anxiety curled in my gut until all the warmth I'd yearned for grew cold in a heartbeat, and it spiraled into a toxic mess of paranoia. As I lay in bed that night, shadows danced against the wall, and every creak of the building's settled sound weighed down heavy on my soul. I thought of Sarah, how long she'd been waiting in that hallway, smirking and waiting for me to unravel before her surprise guests. Under cover of night, I fell asleep with the covers pulled tight, battling my heavy eyelids. Dreams morphed into images of unfamiliar faces and playful laughter. What started as mockery but grew into something darker. One evening, after days of hearing unexplainable sounds and footsteps I swore echoed into my walls, I shoved my sleep-deprived body out of bed, desperately clutching my phone's flashlight. I tried dismissing the chill lingering in my gut, crafting rational explanations as I crept toward each room. But then everything froze. The silhouette of a figure cloaked in the darkness was waiting for me, the shadows lying just behind where the faint moonlight spilled across the living room floor. It didn't look like Sarah, nor did it resemble anyone I had ever met, but there stood someone unfurling that day's events once more like an outlined tragedy of life. The weight of my shame returned tenfold, but the horror of being watched, truly watched, consumed me, drowning me in a surreal fear that felt more human than I'd known. They whispered my name, yet their voice was all wrong, twisted like they'd been remolded by rejection, feasting off my vulnerability in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. I stood rooted in place as their breath curled through the air, carrying with it the fragrance of danger, and in that lingering moment, I realized the seamless facade of my life had cracked wide open, leaving me exposed to a strange combination of hostility and amusement, and suddenly I was buoyed by the horrifying truth. Some stories don't end when we want them to, but rather stretch like an unwelcome guest haunting shadows, willing to reappear right when the light fades away. I've been sneaking out to fuck an old friend in his car for about a week, and what was supposed to be just a bit of reckless fun has turned into something darker, something I never anticipated. It started innocently enough, a few late-night texts to Jake, a guy I grew up with but hadn't seen in years, suddenly reigniting that spark of nostalgia and flirtation as he suggested we meet up at the old parking lot behind the gas station just outside town, a place that was once a refuge for mischief and secrets, and with a mix of excitement and nerves, I slipped out of the house past midnight, the cool night air wrapping around me like a blanket, the thrill of the clandestine meeting sending a rush through my veins. Jake's car was an old beater, the kind you see parked outside high school football games, but inside, it felt strangely intimate, just two laughing bodies in the confined space, and as we stumbled over words, swapping stories of our mundane lives since high school, things quickly went from innocent banter to heated kisses as his hands found their way to my waist, and our bodies melted into each other like we had been doing this forever, the thrill of sneaking around adding an electric charge. But with each rendezvous in that cramped little car, I started to notice odd things, more than just the overwhelming scent of cologne that lingered in the air. Jake would occasionally glance nervously over his shoulder, the way his body tensed when headlights from passing cars illuminated the inside of the vehicle, creating brief moments of panic where I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. At first, I shrugged it off as paranoia or maybe just the natural anxiety of our secret affair, but then one night, as we were whispering sweet nothings in hushed tones, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a shadow beyond the glimmering glass dance just out of sight, but when I turned around, expecting to see someone lurking, the empty darkness swallowed me whole, leaving only an echo of something chilling in the pit of my stomach. It was unsettling, but the thrill of sneaking around had my mind twisted in knots, and I convinced myself it was merely my imagination. The next few nights passed in an intoxicating blur. Outside the car, the world carried on, but inside, we were creating our own little universe, one filled with laughter and moans, until last night, everything changed when I heard him whispering something just behind my ear, something that didn't feel right, and as I pulled back to look him in the eye, I noticed a flicker of something shameful flash across his face, his gaze shifting to the floor as if terrified of what he might say next. I pressed him, but he only brushed it off, claiming it was just a lingering fear that we'd get caught. But I knew better, there was more behind those eyes, and as we made love, quick and desperate, adrenaline coursing through us, I felt his body tense suddenly, a chill running down his spine, and amidst gasps and moans, I heard the unmistakable sound of static choking through the air, as though someone were tuning into a radio frequency, and I froze, my heart pounding as Jake's head snapped up, eyes wide as he turned, looking out the window, and I followed his gaze just in time to see a figure standing under the flickering streetlight, someone dressed in dark clothing, face concealed by the darkness. But the most unsettling part was how still they stood, never moving, just watching us. My blood ran cold as I edged back from the window, fear creeping into my heart as Jake fumbled for his phone, trying to act like it was nothing, but the way he trembled told me he felt it too, an oppressive presence looming over us, and before I could think clearly, Jake turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life louder than my racing thoughts, and we skidded away from that spot, tires screeching against the pavement. But even as we escaped, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had left behind wasn't going to let us slip away so easily. For a few nights, I convinced myself it was just a fluke, a figment of panic in the heat of the moment. We laughed it off, promising to take more care in our escapades, but the figure in the distance never left my thoughts, and when I tried to bring it up to Jake, he just changed the subject, deflecting with dodges crafted to protect some unspoken truth. So naturally, curiosity got the better of me and drove me to go back to that parking lot alone. That eerie silence wrapping around me like a shroud as I crept toward the old gas station, armed with nothing more than a single flashlight and my own resolve. But as I neared the spot, I felt the unsettling sensation that the dark figure had been waiting for me. My heart thumped louder in my chest, echoing in my ears as I flashed my light around, the beam catching nothing but shadows dancing in the gloom. I called out Jake's name, but my voice only fueled the silence, growing thicker around me, and just when I turned to leave, I felt it. A faint whisper in my ear, colder than the night air. It repeated Jake's name like a ghost longing for solace, and before I could comprehend what was happening, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness, and though I could hear my own breaths quickening, I could also hear something else, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to me or the night, and it slithered through the shadows. Panic surged through me, heart racing. I stumbled back as my fingers brushed against something warm and slick against a cold metal pole. And as I yanked my hand back, I felt the heat of breath against my neck, the sound of an unearthly laughter crawling through the silence. I ran, tripped over something unseen, and it took everything I had not to scream. Somehow I reached my car parked just a distance away, fumbling for the keys as I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, gaining on me in the dark. I finally managed to unlock the door, diving inside with all the strength I could muster, slamming the door shut and locking it, eyes darting around. I could feel that presence was now right outside my window, shadowy and suffocating, as that chilling laugh echoed again. Closer this time, reverberating inside my skull, I turned on the headlights, desperate to peel back the suffocating darkness, but when the beams pierced through the gloom, the figure melted away like fog in the morning sun, leaving behind only the lingering silence and a dread I couldn't shake. Trembling, I sped away from that cursed place, and as I crashed back into the faint glow of streetlights, I realized my relationship with Jake had morphed into something unrecognizable, wrapped in layers of fear and guilt that I wasn't sure I could untangle. And the strangest thing was, when I turned the car onto our old road, my phone lit up, a message from Jake flashing across the screen. It read, "Where are you? I'm waiting for you at the lot. I need you." In that moment, my blood ran colder than before, as I realized there was more to this game we were playing, something twisted edging closer, and the haunting truth dawned on me that the one who wanted to see me back at the lot wasn't Jake at all. I don't get close to people anymore, it seems. That's fine. It wasn't always this way. I used to be sociable, full of laughter and enthusiasm, weaving friendships into the fabric of my lonely life, until that summer when everything changed. It began innocently enough, with a benign connection to a secluded online forum dedicated to true crime. I loved hearing about the twisted tales of murder and betrayal, but one thread caught my eye, a chilling discussion about a local urban legend, the puppeteer of Hollow Creek. It was said that he would befriend lonely souls, drawing them into his web before stealing their lives away, leaving behind nothing but hollow shells. Skeptical yet intrigued, I monitored the thread as people recounted their encounters, dismissing them as mere horror stories crafted for entertainment. Until I stumbled upon a post that hit too close to home. A user described how they met the puppeteer at a local cafe. They were alone, drawn in by his charm and the affection he so easily feigned. It was during a sleepless night when I regrettably decided to reply, sharing my own sense of isolation and my overwhelming anxiety about connecting with others. That was my first mistake. Hours passed with no response, but I pushed it aside, telling myself that it was just digital noise, until the first message came in. "You're not alone anymore." It sent a chill racing down my spine. Curious, I clicked on the user's profile, and my blood ran cold. There were no details, no posts. Just the eerie username, Puppeteer. I tried to ignore it, but for the next few days, I received messages that felt too personal, too invasive, almost like he was watching me. I deleted my account, thinking I could escape, but the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes trailing my every move, never left. I noticed strange figures lurking on the edges of my vision, disappearing the moment I'd turned to look. I stopped leaving my house, hiding away. Weeks turned into months of solitude, and I convinced myself it was better to be lonely than to risk meeting someone like him. Besides, safety was found in solitude, I kept telling myself, and that's fine. Then one evening, a knock echoed through my apartment, sharp and unsettling. I froze, breath hitching as my heart raced. Glancing through the peephole, I saw a figure standing in the dim light, elegantly dressed, the contours of his face obscured by shadow. My blood ran cold as I recognized the silhouette. It looked just like the vague details the users had posted when recounting their encounters with the puppeteer. Panic surged through me, flooding my senses. I scrambled back from the door, phone in hand, ready to call the police when the figure began to speak, his voice a soft, melodic whisper that wound around my thoughts like a vice. "I can help you. You don't have to be alone." I dropped my phone, dread tumbling through me as he continued, "I see you. I know that you're lonely. Just let me in." His words were laced with an almost hypnotic quality, clawing at my fears and insecurities, tempting me to relinquish my solitude. I wanted to turn away, to find solace in the idea that I could shield myself, but the longing for connection began to bubble to the surface as I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. "You think I don't know what you need?" His voice was like velvet, seductive yet ominous, slithering into my mind. "The things that frighten you are the very things that can set you free. Hidden in darkness, I know the truth." He paused then, and the silence that stretched between us felt palpable, suffocating. "I can show you." My resolve shattered, and without thinking, I unlatched the door, my hand trembling as I pulled it open just a crack. He stood there, eyes twinkling with a predatory glint, and the moment our eyes locked, I felt an odd warmth. My brain raced, wondering if maybe I'd made a mistake, or if, against all odds, he was telling the truth. "Come play with me," he said, and with a smile that looked like a dark promise, I stepped through the threshold. I barely took notice of the world around me as he led me outside into the moonlit night, and for what felt like the first time in years, I felt exhilarated. He guided me deeper into the woods that bordered my neighborhood, the trees looming like ancient sentinels surrounding us, and as we walked, he spoke of his collection, an archive of fears and delights intertwined, shadows moving like marionettes in the corners of my vision. There was magic in his words, a twisted enchantment that unraveled the very fabric of my past loneliness, but with each step, the laughter grew faint, and my heart pounded with dread. He stopped by a clearing illuminated by flickering lanterns that cast long shadows, revealing a stage dressed in vibrant colors, a world alive with twisted whimsy. I was drawn in, entranced by the performance he was putting on, a grotesque display of people whose absences seemed to linger even in the air. Their laughter was empty, their faces as pale as bone, reflecting a lifetime of moments forever stolen. And in that instant, the charm slipped, realization crashed upon me like a wave. I wasn't simply experiencing a show, I was witnessing the fate of those who had come before, the hollow echoes of lost connections. I watched as he reached for me, a smile stretched across his face, and I stumbled backward, trying to retreat from the horror before me. But it was too late, the puppeteer's strings had already taken hold, weaving into my veins like an intoxicating poison. Suddenly, the air shifted, and I felt an unbearable sense of dread as shadows danced around us, whispering secrets of those he had taken, locking them in this forsaken place. The laughter turned into screams, a cacophony of despair that filled the night. In my moment of panic, I ran, pushing through the trees, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon me as I fled, the sounds of his laughter trailing me like a haunting melody that twisted my insides. I stumbled through the woods, disoriented, my heart a drum in my chest until I finally broke free, emerging into the familiar stretch of my neighborhood. Then silence enveloped me, heavy and oppressive, and I thought I was safe, until I turned, finally breathing in relief, only to find the puppeteer standing at the edge of the trees, face illuminated by the moonlight, a ghostly grin dancing across his lips. "You can't escape who you are," he called out, his voice echoing like a phantom, and I realized in that harrowing moment, I would never truly be free. The seeds of my loneliness had taken root, and he had promised he would always be there, waiting just out of sight. I don't get close to people anymore it seems, and that's fine. It's less painful to exist in the shadows of my own making than to risk feeling something that could only lead to an inevitable descent into darkness, so I stay alone, weaving my own threads, knowing the puppeteer always watches, lurking on the periphery of my life, reminding me that the moment I mistake isolation for safety, I may find those very shadows dancing all too close. For the past year, I've learned to navigate the dizzying labyrinth of office politics with the finesse of a cat burglar. I have perfected the ability to blend into the beige walls of cubicles, relying on a carefully curated facade that keeps my coworkers oblivious to the fact that I have been barely working, to the point where my job feels like a ghost haunting me, something I can just barely see in the dim light of the fluorescent bulbs. You see, it all started with a quiet realization: nobody really watches over anyone anymore. Not in this post-pandemic world where remote work and hybrid schedules have blurred the lines between effort and apathy. It was just a subtle shift in how we operated, fewer meetings, fewer eyes on screens at 9 a.m. I discovered a groove where emails and reports, once my daily burden, became an afterthought, a mere whimsical notion. I found myself participating in the endless Zoom calls, muted and resting my camera on the ceiling fan, while I perused various conspiracy theories online, skillfully responding with just enough jargon to appear engaged, tossing out half-cocked ideas that always seemed to hit the mark, until I became a ghost of productivity. My colleagues praised my so-called insight, and with each passing month, it filled me with an odd mix of unease and elation, as I watched how easily they bought into my charade. As the year dragged on, I could feel the weight of complacency settle like dust on the shelves of my soul. Though part of me felt guilty, I relished the growing ease of my life. Yet, something buried beneath complacency began to gnaw at my insides, a growing sense of dread that perhaps this blissful neglect could not last forever. I would occasionally glance out of the slatted blinds towards the gray sky, half expecting some sort of divine revelation or swift punishment for my sloth, but instead, the world continued on without skipping a beat. Then, things started getting a little strange when I began receiving anonymous emails filled with cryptic messages, black scripts that hinted at my careless situation. At first, I dismissed them as pranks by disgruntled coworkers, perhaps those who could smell the stagnation whirling around me like invisible smoke. But my idle imagination spiraled. The emails grew darker, more accusatory, their tone shifting from playful to menacing. "You're being watched," the last one read, with no signature, just a screenshot of my own disinterested face taken during one of those Zoom meetings where I thought myself invisible. It shook my ability to remain complacent, awakening a horrid curiosity, spurring me into action. Late at night, In the flickering glow of my laptop, as I navigated the murky back alleys of my IT department's files, something in my stomach churned violently. I uncovered data logs, revealing that someone had been tracking me, mapping my digital footprints through company servers. The realization spiraled into a frenzy, as shadows grew long around my desk. I need to defend myself, but how? Doubts plagued my thoughts. I was no longer simply avoiding work, I was now at war with an unseen adversary, one whose motives I couldn't begin to fathom. Anxiety turned my coffee blacker, my heart raced as I thought about unraveling the threads of my deceit, only to find myself confronting whoever lay behind the screen. And then the night came when cowardice finally left my side, propelling me to meet the mystery head-on. The office would be empty, I determined, a perfect stage for whatever power game was being played unbeknownst to me. Armed with my laptop and a rickety resolve, I entered the gray cube at midnight, illuminated by the glow of stale light. It only took a few clicks to discover a file hidden deep within the core of our company network, labeled Project Watcher. Its contents were incomprehensible, data after data, detailing not just my inactivity but those of others who, unbeknownst to me, had also sidled into sloth. This wasn't merely some prank, it was predation. Suddenly, the silence of the night shattered with the creaking of the office door, and I froze in terror. A figure slipped through, cloaked in shadows, their face obscured but their presence unmistakably malicious, and my heart thundered in uncertainty and fear as I realized this was no corporate overlord stand-in, but the embodiment of my guilt that I had so skillfully avoided, a fierce reminder that negligence has a way of manifesting into something corporeal. They approached my desk with an eerie calmness, and I could only watch in horror as their gloved hand reached out towards my screen, filling my mind with thoughts of confrontation and justification. "You wanted to get away with nothing, didn't you?" Their voice hissed, equal parts eerie and firm, and in that moment, I knew that indeed I was no longer simply battling for my job. This was a reckoning, a physical manifestation of every late report, every unnoticed absence, eyes that had finally opened to the shame of laziness I had embraced all too willingly. I stumbled back in disbelief as the figure loomed closer, and the lights flickered ominously, the very air thickened with the tension of inevitability. "It's time to put in some real work, don't you think?" they purred, and in an instant, the world broke open, exposing the far reaches of my negligence. I could hear the cacophony of hushed whispers echoing off the walls, the harsh judgment of those I'd wronged, their eyes piercing my stunted resolve, pinning me to the very essence of accountability. I realized that this act of subterfuge had consequences. Nobody leaves the stage without a price to pay. I woke up the next morning in my bed, drenched in sweat, my laptop beside me, closed, yet the weight of the dream remained heavy, a lingering attachment that branded me. The office moved on as if nothing had happened. I played my part, expertly feigning normalcy, but now I hold the secret of that night, the knowledge that every action has an echo, a lingering trace that cannot be unmade. And when the whispers began again, slowly gathering intensity, I decided I would no longer be the ghost in the office, hiding in plain sight. I would seize control of my fate. Yet as I took a couple of steps into my workspace, I couldn't shake off the feeling that those watching weren't through with me yet. The tendrils of fear resurfaced, vibrating beneath my skin, a quiet reminder that indeed, once you embrace apathy, it may just embrace you back in ways you never saw coming. Every town has its secrets, but in the small, sleepy community of Maple Hollow, the most cursed of them all drifted through the damp air like fog. It started on a Wednesday in late October, with rustling leaves and the smell of impending rain, a day so ordinary that it felt almost sinister. I had just turned 17, old enough to crave adventure yet still tangled in the naivete of youth. My friends had planned a trip to the old Whitaker house, a crumbling mansion at the edge of town, steeped in rumors of the supernatural. Everyone claimed the ghosts of its former inhabitants roamed its halls, seeking something lost. We snuck in under the cover of darkness, like kids playing hide and seek, hearts pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, but we laughed nervously, daring each other to explore. I went first, clutching a flashlight that flickered ominously, its beam cutting through the thick shadows. My friends called after me, their whispers echoing in the desolate rooms as I wandered deeper into the abyss of the house. It was then that I found the door, slightly ajar, leading to the basement, a space the older kids warned us never to enter. Curiosity clawed at my throat more fervently than the fear of the unknown, so I pushed it open and descended the creaking stairs. The air grew colder, wrapping around me like a shroud, and as I reached the bottom, the light from my flashlight fell upon something I can only describe as an altar, adorned with dried flowers, old photographs, and what appeared to be a sickly sweet substance smeared across the floor. a grotesque offering of something long forgotten. That's when I noticed the walls dripping with what looked like old paint, but it wasn't paint, it was blood, dried and darkened, forming crude symbols and shapes that sent chills racing down my spine. Moving closer to inspect, I thought I heard whispering, not from my friends but from the dark corners of the basement, an indistinct murmur that piqued my instincts to flee. But then there it was, a figure in the shadows, slumped against the wall, its hair matted and its clothes ragged. I blinked in disbelief. It was a girl, older than me, I think, or maybe not. Her eyes, hollow and vacant, met mine, and in that moment, everything sharp faded away, the laughter of my friends, the sense of adventure, my heart starting to race not out of thrill but sheer terror. She raised a hand, her finger stained with that same grotesque substance, and slowly traced a line across her throat, a gesture of suffering that twisted something deep within me. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught itself in my throat as her lips moved, forming words that never graced my ears, silent pleas wrapped in agony. I felt the gut-wrenching impulse to turn and run, to escape this trap of horror, yet I stood frozen, aware that whatever dark energy had pulled me into that house was now holding me captive, forcing me to witness something I wasn't sure I was meant to see. I glanced back at the stairs and saw my friends, their silhouettes flickering in the distance, and all I wanted was to shout for them to get out, to leave this nightmare behind, but the girl's gaze tugged on my conscience, a guilt that weighed down my breaths. I moved closer. "Are you okay?" I finally managed to whisper, though the moment I spoke, her pleading expression hardened, a deep ferocity coloring her features. "No one can help me. No one can hear," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I should have retreated then, but I couldn't. A part of me wanted to understand why she was there, trapped in a hell of her own making. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They took my words," she replied, her own trembling hands reaching out, "and now I'm lost in the silence." The sound of my friend's laughter seemed to grow distant, an echo of a life I no longer belonged to, a chilling realization coming alive in me. The girl was a part of something deeper, a victim of a story that outlived her breath. I wanted to pull away, to shake off the feeling of helplessness, but I was chained to this moment of revelation as she suddenly began to writhe, the wall behind her pulsating, as if the house itself hungered for her presence. I glanced back one last time to see my friends about to flood through the door. Panic surged, and I shouted, "Get out! Don't come down here!" Their laughter broke, confusion replacing their bemusement as they turned to face me. I needed them to understand, needed them to turn and leave before it was too late, before whatever the girl was feeding on reached out and swallowed us whole. But as I spun back to her, the silence deepened, she was gone, and the room began to tremble, the very foundation groaning as shadows enveloped me. It took a single heartbeat for darkness to explode into chaos, and I felt myself falling backward, tumbling away from the light as her screams echoed through the endless void, the haunting resonance seeping into my bones, urging me not to forget, but I did. I bolted up the stairs, utterly absorbed in the frantic battle to escape, my heart hammering as I burst through the door. My friends grabbed me, wide-eyed, demanding to know what happened. But even as I tried to speak, to save them, the words sputtered like wet matches, failing to ignite the truth of what I had seen. We fled the house, its walls collapsing in on themselves behind us, but when we reached the street, breathless and wild-eyed, I cast a final glance back. The mansion stood still, almost serene in the dwindling light, swallowing what had just transpired, leaving me with nothing but the weight of my silence. Days turned into months, and the image of the girl became a phantom in the recesses of my mind. I replayed the scene countless times, but each retelling stripped the essence from it, leaving me feeling hollow. Until one quiet night, with the memory haunting me, I made the reckless decision to return, armed only with a flickering flashlight and my own guilt. As I crossed the threshold, the air thickened, and I felt her presence creeping back into my spine. I staggered down those stairs once again, prepared for the worst, but the altar lay abandoned, the blood dried and cold, no signs of her sorrow lingering. I called out, desperation clawing at my chest, "Where are you?" But the silence swallowed my voice whole. I stood alone in the stillness, feeling the suffocating absence where anguish had once held me wrapped. It was in that moment, with dread settling around me, that I understood, I would never forget what I saw, I could never speak of it, and would never be free from the silence that followed me quietly like a shadow, whispering endlessly that I had failed to save her, that the moment had passed, and though I had chosen to say nothing at all, her words were forever etched in my soul. It was a night I'll never forget with a man I'll probably never see again. a night shrouded in the kind of darkness that swallowed the flickers of my small-town streetlights, as if the universe itself conspired to keep the sky a suffocating black. I had just moved back home after college, tired, anxious, and still reeling from the pressure of deadlines that never seemed to end, and I decided to walk to the only convenience store that stayed open late, just to grab a pack of smokes. The air was pregnant with the scent of rain as it threatened to fall, and the muffled echoes of distant thunder turned from somewhere deep in the oppressive clouds. It was after 11 when I reached the store, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow that felt so out of place against the wildness of the surrounding night. I could tell the cashier was just as bored as I felt, scrolling through his phone with a vacant expression. I snagged my smokes and, as I stepped out into the cool night air, I noticed a figure leaning against the brick wall beside the store, a man whose presence sent an odd shiver along my spine. He wore a long black coat that seemed to absorb the light, and his face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. For a fleeting moment, I considered turning back and heading home, but something about his demeanor intrigued me. He seemed to radiate an almost magnetic pull, like a moth to a flame, and so, against my better judgment, I approached him. "You look lost," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like dried leaves skimming over asphalt. I laughed uneasily, not quite sure how to respond, and when I glanced up to meet his gaze, the intensity of his eyes unsettled me. They were a vibrant, unnatural shade of blue, almost too bright for the darkness that cloaked him, and I felt an involuntary chill as he fixed me with that penetrating stare. I was startled when he, without any prompt, began telling me a story, about a cursed forest that swallowed anyone who dared enter beyond dusk, how its trees whispered secrets to those unlucky enough to wander too close. The rain began to fall then, a soft patter that turned into a downpour, and we huddled beneath the store's awning as he painted chilling images with words that drew me in deeper, each tale punctuated with an eerie detail that dragged me further from reality. He spoke of a man who had lost his way, who had ventured into that dark place and emerged changed. "You see, some places don't just hold shadows, they hold memories," he said, his gaze unwavering. The allure of his storytelling made the world around us fade, and I found myself hanging on his every word, even as pure dread started creeping into my bones. As he spoke of lost souls and anguish, the atmosphere thickened, and I could swear I saw something moving in the shadows of the alleyway behind him, an elongation, a flicker of movement that felt almost sentient. "You should be careful where you tread, especially when the night calls out to you," the man said, a smile playing upon his lips, and it sent another ripple of unease coursing through me. I wanted to turn back home, to leave whatever strange magic had woven itself around this moment, but I found myself indulging his eerie tales, entangled in the fear he was weaving. Hours slipped by like the minutiae of time had melted. Gripped by fascination, I learned about his own dark encounters. He spoke like a prophet, like someone who had danced too closely to the fire and bore the scars of his own mistakes. The weight of his stories clung to me, his every word a thread tying me to the unfolding panic, and before I knew it, I was sharing my own fears, my own vulnerabilities, what brought me back to this town, the crushing loneliness that pressed upon my chest. He listened, nodding in an understanding nothing could prepare me for. Then, just as quickly as the atmosphere thickened, the rain suddenly subsided, and an uncomfortable silence enveloped us, pregnant with expectancy. I looked at him then, expecting to see that unsettling smile, but instead his eyes shifted to something behind me, a flicker of concern sparking across his features. "You should go," he said, his tone startlingly serious. "You're not safe here." I glanced around, a visceral need to flee taking root as my heart raced. In that moment, I felt it, something lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlight's glow, something watching from the depths of the shadows, and with its presence came an unbearable dread that sent me scrambling away. I whipped around toward my distant home, the streets now a labyrinthine stretch of anxiety as I raced to escape this night that had started so innocently. My breath came in gasps, and I could still feel that man's gaze boring into me, urging me onward, but as I reached the edge of my neighborhood, I paused, my heart collapsing in confusion. I turned back, searching for him, but the corner where he had stood was now empty, swallowed by the thick black that gripped the night sky. That lingering sense of dread remained, stretching beyond the confines of the evening until it settled into my bones, but try as I might, I could never shake that feeling that whatever dark force had prowled at the periphery of my existence was waiting for the moment to embrace me fully. I finally made it home, slamming the door behind me and locking every bolt, my chest heaving as I attempted to process the madness of it all. For weeks after that ghastly encounter, I tried to dismiss it as a bizarre night in a small town, but I couldn't shake the urgency in the man's voice or the sensation of being watched that followed me everywhere. The locals surely thought I was crazy when I started asking about him, but no one knew who I was speaking of. It was as if he had never existed. Then, a few weeks later, in a fit of recklessness, I decided to visit that cursed forest he spoke of, the temptation of the unknown gnawing at my sanity, seeking clarification of the fear that had gripped me. I went deeper into those woods, embraced by shadows that felt alive, and a realization washed over me: the night had come alive, and in its chill, I felt a pull, one so powerful it was as if the shadows themselves reached out for me. I wandered farther than I ever planned to, drawn to whispers that teased me from the depths of the trees. I don't remember how long I was there before I noticed the trees closing in, encircling me in a claustrophobic embrace. It was then that I finally understood the true horror of that night, the man's warning, and the terrors that lurked beyond. I felt something cold and malevolent wrap around my ankle, pulling me down, deeper into a place where shadows held all the answers, and I screamed, my voice lost to the night, a soul swallowed whole, a night I'd never forget with a man I would never see again, for I was now part of his dales, helpless against the remnants of darkness and despair entwined within those cursed woods. I never thought a simple layover would turn into a nightmare, but it started innocuously enough. My flight from New York to Los Angeles had been delayed, the news echoing through the terminal like a death knell for my plans, and before I knew it, I was pacing past the bars, the smooth hum of low conversations and the clink of ice in glasses enticing me like a siren's call. So I sat, ordering a whiskey sour just to take the edge off the frustration, telling myself I'd only have one to calm my nerves, but each taste of that sweetly bitter concoction pulled me deeper, and by the third drink, I was already starting to feel the buzz, which turned into a heady high within an hour, and the world around me morphed into something surreal. People laughed too loudly, announcements buzzed like angry flies, and the neon lights of the bar blended into one dazzling blur. I barely noticed when they called my flight for boarding, but a sinking feeling in my gut prompted me to check my watch just to see the numbers rush past me like spilled ink, a mere few minutes late, and when I stumbled through the gate, the attendant's angry finger wagging in the air told me I was too late, though I'd swear I caught a glimpse of the jet's wing jutting out from the window, mocking me from the tarmac. I spent the next hour slumped at the bar, furiously downing another drink and lamenting my bad luck, just breathing life into my sorrows like pouring whiskey over ice, until I should have learned my lesson. But that happy haze, that optically distorted sense of time and reality pushed me to pull out my phone to rebook, and before I knew it, I was looking at the next flight, feeling pride swell in my chest as I tapped the screen, thinking if I calmed down, I could meet my friends in California, still be part of the fun. But patience was not on my side. I continued to sip and laugh with strangers, forging connections powered by our collective misery of missed connections and sticky floors, each round erasing all sense of responsibility I should have felt, until my world turned upside down once again when the screen flashed with a warning of the next flight boarding. Again I checked the time, this time racing to gather my things, desperate and giddy, all at once, like the chaos of a soldier preparing for battle, knowing full well I was stepping into a battlefield of anxiety. But, heaven help me, I was hammered, too far gone to process my mistakes. I stumbled through the terminal, dodging a small child and some businessman with a briefcase that seemed like an apparition caught in my peripheral. My heart was racing, a pounding thrill feeding into my drunken courage, and in the moment of oblivion, when I reached the gate, exhaling relief, I lifted my head only to be met with a stony-faced attendant. That same accusatory finger out like lightning pointed straight at me, implying I was a fool for even dreaming it possible to join them once again. I cursed, with such vivid clarity I shocked myself, saying things I shouldn't in public while the others stared or snickered at my disarray of both appearance and manner, the last remaining shred of what was once my dignity lost somewhere among the tables and bars that grinned at me through the haze. With this stunned realization igniting my senses, I called after the departing flight, desperation clawing through my mind. But it was no use. The plane disappeared, leaving me alone and shaking in a terminal I had begun to despise, punctuated only by the heavy thumping of my heart and an impending sense of doom, my sense of self crumbling under the weight of staggering embarrassment. Finally, as the alcohol settled into a dull numbness, I trudged back to the bar, the only constant in the swirling chaos, and ordered another drink, trying to talk myself into an acceptance of my fate. After all, it was just one day, right? But with each sip, a primal panic slithered across my skin, a nagging thought urging me to leave, to run away, to get out and away before it all consumed me, and despite the ache in my head and the bitterness clawing at my throat, I hesitated, glancing up at the flickering lights overhead, and that's when everything changed. As the light flickered again, Shadows began to stretch, elongating across the floor, pressed and pulled until they morphed into unsettling shapes, what appeared to be figures, with faces half melted, eyes drooping and mouths wide, as if screaming but no sound reaching my ears. My heart raced, panic igniting every nerve, clawing at me like something alive, and as I felt their gaze seeping into my skin, I dropped the glass at my feet, its shattering echoing in the silence, only amplifying the feeling that I wasn't alone, like they were here for me, locked in a malevolent dance that threatened to engulf me. Yet as I stumbled back, trying to escape this twisted tableau, somehow the chaos around faded away, swallowed by an inexplicable stillness. The bustling airport dimmed and all noise hushed, leaving just me and them, figures that lurked, looming just out of reach, smiling cruelly, beckoning me, and as I turned to run, my legs felt like jelly, my heart thundering in my ears, yet the horrors didn't relent. They chased me through the terminal, the world around me a cherry red warning sign, the faces mounting as if they fed off my terror, urging me into some dark labyrinth I couldn't comprehend. And when I finally reached the exit, gasping for breath, grasping at the handle of the sliding door, a solid shiver gripped my spine as I realized the outside wasn't filled with bright sunshine and promise, but sheer darkness, a smog that seemed to swirl and breathe. And just as I turned back to scream for help, they were upon me, a swarm of whispers drowning my voice, and in that heartbeat, I disappeared from the world once more, never to clutch my dreams of California, my soul stuck in limbo between two missed flights, a drunken mistake on a forgotten day, lost forever to the shadows of my choices. I don't always come home from work straight away, I pull over somewhere and chill for an hour or so. It started as a harmless habit, a way to decompress after an exhausting day at the call center, where the sound of my voice droning through endless customer complaints blurred my sense of self. I found this rundown park on the outskirts of town that nobody seemed to visit, an oasis of disconnection, with its crooked picnic tables and the hollow echo of silence. It became my refuge. At first, I'd play solitaire on my phone or scroll aimlessly through social media, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and the park descended into a veil of shadow, I began to notice the transformations of the landscape around me. One evening, as I kicked pebbles on the path, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A figure in a faded brown hoodie, its face obscured, stood by the edge of the woods. I waved, half-heartedly expecting them to retreat into the thicket, but they merely stared, their eyes glinting unnaturally in the dim light. Rather than panic, a strange sense of calm enveloped me, as if they were a part of the scenery, another shade of night creeping into my world. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal, that I'd simply imagined the whole encounter from spending too much time alone. But after that, every time I parked at the old lot, I felt a pulse of energy in the air, a whisper of unseen eyes watching me from behind the trees. The figure returned again, always motionless, always just out of reach. I learned their routine. On Tuesdays, they'd be there just as the sun vanished, and on Thursdays, they'd be gone before I settled into my usual spot. I started rearranging my schedule, choosing to leave work late, my heart racing with anticipation when I finally saw them, little more than a shadow, yet almost magnetic in their stillness. I began to stay longer, often pushing past the hour mark, drawn to the thrill of the unknown, the urge to understand what this specter wanted from me. But as the weeks crept on, dread seeped into my fascination. One chilly evening, the figure approached the car, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly okay with the distance that loomed between us. Their hoodie hung loosely, hiding all but the faint outline of their body. My heart thumped. I contemplated leaving, revving my engine, but my curiosity swelled into something louder, compelling me to stay. I rolled down my window, hesitating like a fool, and asked, "Who are you?" The figure simply cocked its head, and in that moment, I could almost feel the trees lean in, as if they were waiting for the answer just as much as I was. They drew closer, the rustling leaves around them amplifying a tension I couldn't quite escape, and finally spoke. "You leave them every night, don't you?" The words sliced through the crisp air, chilling me to the bone. I stammered, grappling with the unexpected emotion that washed over me, an unsettling mix of recognition and fear. "No, I don't," I protested. But the figure merely smiled, though I could not see their lips move beneath the fabric of the hoodie. "Is that what you tell yourself?" I didn't understand, yet I felt strings pulling, colors swirling in my mind as if fate had rewinded a terrible secret from my past, something I'd tossed in a box deep within my mind. As if my insides churned, the memories streamed in, late phone calls, neglected promises, and unmade decisions that had haunted me ever since my brother vanished without a trace 5 years ago. My throat tightened, breath caught in a web of regret as I gripped the steering wheel, eyes wide, seeking clarity in the dim light cast by my headlights. That night, I drove home feeling heavy, yet light, like I'd peeled a layer of myself off. The figure hadn't been a stranger but a haunting memory shaped like a person, a catalyst for the guilt I bore in silence. I tried to shake the sensation, but it crept back, a relentless specter in my mind. Days turned into weeks, and every time I parked at the lot, the figure seemed to glide between my thoughts and the reality outside my window. They became a linkage to the sense of hope I had lost somewhere in my brother's absence. On the occasions when I neglected to visit the park and rushed home, I could almost feel their expectant gaze on my back, coaxing me to return, to confront what I was running from. My co-workers began noticing my changing demeanor, whispers of concern circling their conversations, but I brushed them off, convincing myself I was fine, that this was just a way to reclaim a portion of myself lost to grief. One particularly frigid night, after a hellish shift, I felt a summons nearly magnetic, driving me to the park with a purpose that I could no longer deny. My heart pounded in anticipation as I parked in that familiar space, the darkness wrapping around me like an embrace. The figures stood where they always did, but this time, there was an air of finality in their stillness. I could sense the weight of every unconfessed secret and the echoed memories of loss and guilt tingling against my skin. I climbed out of my car, the air was thick, my breath hanging in the night, and for the first time, I whispered as if speaking to the darkness itself, "I'm sorry." The figure stepped closer, their silhouette melding with the night until all I could see were their eyes, reflecting the last remnants of daylight. Without a word, they reached behind them and handed me a small, weather-worn object, a keychain, twisted and contorted, that felt oddly warm in my palm. The familiarity ignited the flame of memories, it had been my brother's. Rage and sorrow bubbled within me, the unquenchable need for closure spiraling. I looked up, demanding understanding, but all I saw was a fleeting silhouette being swallowed by the shadows of the trees. I gasped, a hollowness pooling in my chest, as I staggered back to my car, the keychain clutched tightly in my hand. Driving home that night, I didn't know if I freed a piece of my past or if the figure was a reflection of what I still had to confront. The park visits became less frequent, burdened with meaning and unwilling to offer solace like before. Yet, every now and then, as the lonely streetlights flickered past my window, I could see them standing at the edge of the woods on a Tuesday or Thursday. I learned then that the specters we try to avoid often find us in the corners of our minds, waiting to be acknowledged. One afternoon, weeks later, I sat on my couch, that keychain still in my pocket, reflecting on everything I had left unspoken, and felt a pull to those forgotten hours at the park. I could almost hear the rustling whispers beckoning me to return, to sit in silence as darkness enveloped the world outside. No longer did I see the figure as a ghoul of my past but as a guide to my future. So I drove back to the park, ready to face my haunting. When I pulled up, my breath caught in my throat. The figure wasn't there. I felt disoriented, as if I had stumbled into an alternate reality I never knew existed. I opened the car door, stepping onto the grounds rendered barren and brightened by strange lights that flickered just beyond the trees, inviting me closer with their pulse. There, a previous absence in the shadows revealed something far worse. The park pulsed as if it were alive, and I was not alone after all. I took a trembling step forward, the keychain in my pocket heating, an urgency blossoming within me, pulling me toward the heart of the park where the lights beckoned, a truth waiting to engulf me whole. I could feel the figure born from the shadows begin to stretch and weave around me, watching silently, the night alive with stories untold. I used my infant son's stroller to shoplift food, while he was in it. It's a reality I never thought I'd face, the gnawing desperation that drives a mother to the edge, forcing her to make choices she once thought unimaginable. The first time I did it, I was frazzled, teetering on the brink of a breakdown after losing my job and with bills piling up, threatening to swallow me whole. I wasn't the type to steal, but as I wandered the aisles of the grocery store with my son cooing innocently in his stroller, I felt his piercing blue eyes on me, and I could practically hear him asking if we would have dinner tonight. It was a sickening twist of fate. I reached for a box of baby food when my hand brushed against a pack of 2-for-1 chips, and the idea wormed its way into my mind. What if I could take a few extra things? After all, who would look at a mother and her baby and suspect her of thievery? As I carefully plotted my small heist, I searched for the perfect items to fit beneath the stroller, monitoring the cameras like a fish watching the shark circling beneath the surface of the water. My heart raced and my palms trembled, but I felt a thrill I couldn't deny. It was wrong, deeply, horrifically wrong. But it was also a rush. I grabbed packets of ramen, cans of soup, handfuls of snacks, all easy to stow without attracting attention, while my son remained blissfully unaware, wriggling happily in his little mobile fortress of safety. When I finally made it to the self-checkout, my hands were shaking so much that I spilled change everywhere, eliciting an annoyed sigh from the attendant, but somehow, no one paid attention as I hastily scanned the few mundane items I could actually afford, pushing the rest beneath the seat while keeping my baby occupied with a rattle. The adrenaline surged through me as I finally slipped out of the store, heart hammering in my chest, not from the weight of the stolen groceries, but from the weight of my guilt. That night, as I laid out the food before my son, it was like a feast, even though I knew it was stolen and wrong, and yet my baby laughed and chewed with such joy that for just a moment, I felt like everything would be okay despite the knot of shame in my stomach. But, as the days turned into weeks, what started as a desperate measure evolved into a way of life as normal as breathing. I became a pro at my little escapades, my routines, and my daring maneuvers, always taking extra care to avoid the same stores or to dodge certain aisles where the cameras were particularly unforgiving. Each Saturday, I would strap my son into his stroller and venture back into the retail jungle, slipping essentials into the undercarriage as my heart raced and fear intertwined with the adrenaline of stealing, the sound of my baby's laughter echoing in my ears like a haunting refrain. I became a master of camouflage, exhibiting the casual swagger of a mother just out for a stroll, while beneath the innocent facade, my guilt and paranoia spiraled into a vicious cycle. I even started bringing a friend along, someone who was in the same boat as me, struggling just to eat. For a while, we traded off to lessen the risk, filling our strollers with the comforts of life while cocooning our babies in blankets of ignorance. But one fateful evening, everything changed. I had been in a rush, distracted by a particularly cranky baby who had realized the chaos of our activities, squirming and whining in protest as I stuffed a frozen pizza beneath the stroller, the weight heavy on my soul as I told myself this was the last time, this was all going to end if I could just get through tonight. Just as we were about to make our escape, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a familiar face, a store employee, one I'd seen before, watching from a distance with a calm but piercing glance. In that moment, I froze, my skin tingling with dread as my brain screamed at me to get out, to run, to protect my child. I'm not sure what I thought would happen, but I felt my heart drop as I pushed the stroller forward and my mind raced, desperately calculating my next move while my friend called out to me from behind, urging me to keep going. Panic set in as I navigated the narrow aisles, the air thick with unanswerable questions as my heart drummed against my ribs. I could hear the footsteps following us, growing closer, echoing menacingly in my ears as I maneuvered through the hustle and bustle of the store, glancing behind to see the employee weaving through the racks, moving faster, and though I never thought I would shoplift again, the impulse was so sharp, so immediate, that all logic dissipated into pure survival. Before I knew it, I was staring at the exit. But just before I reached the doors, a large hand gripped the shoulder of my coat. Whirling around, I was met with a familiar pair of eyes, only this time twisted with disappointment. I heard my son scream, the high-pitched wail that could pierce through steel, and suddenly, I was yanked back into reality, realizing I had crossed that line and left innocence behind, not just for him but for myself, too. The embarrassment overwhelmed me as the employee whispered something about the police, and again, I could see the judgment in the faces of shoppers glancing at my shattered facade, the facade I built around motherhood and desperation crumbling into dust. I wanted to scream, to deny it all until my voice turned hoarse, but all I could do was turn to my son, who had shifted from laughter to fear, his tiny lips trembling, and in that moment, I realized I had betrayed him with my choices. As I was escorted away, I felt my world spinning out of control, my heart dropped with each step until I was out of the store. Only the reality of my actions resonating through me as I was placed in the cold grip of handcuffs, now truly afraid of what my life would become, but the thought that haunted me the most was of my son, stripped of safety, and I knew then, beyond the palm of that large hand gripping me, I had stolen our future too. Everything lay shattered at my feet, and what had begun as a desperate act of survival had turned into a nightmare I could never escape. My best friend got me pregnant when I was 16, and I never told anyone. And as I sit here on the edge of my bed writing this down, I feel a chill crawl up my spine. I could almost forget it if I tried hard enough, but that twisted summer changed everything, when we were just kids playing an innocent game of truth or dare, where secrets poured out like cheap wine, the air thick with laughter and soft summer breezes, all until the dare turned into something neither of us expected. As we sat cloaked in the shadows of the trees behind my house, hearts racing from the thrill of it all, we made a pact to embrace our curiosity. Chocolate bar wrappers and laughter littering our spot just like the moments that would soon turn into mistakes that felt more like choices, and on that night, under the ghostly glow of the moon, we crossed a line that would haunt me for the rest of my life, At first, everything felt euphoric, like we were untouchable, but when the weight of what we'd done settled heavily in my stomach, reality caught up too fast. I started feeling different, drifting into dark corners of my mind where I would choke on the truth I carried like a lead ball, and as the days blurred into weeks, the little signs began to unveil a secret I couldn't face. Each morning was a new battle as I tiptoed around my own body, anxious and afraid. I didn't want to ruin what we had, didn't want to shatter our friendship into 1,000 jagged pieces that could never be glued back together, and with every missed period and every queasy morning, I could hear my own heart pounding like a death knell reminding me of my choices, and still, I said nothing, not to him, not to my parents, not even to the friends who'd sensed my absence from the normally vibrant girl they once knew. I felt like a ghost hovering above my skin, and when I finally summoned the courage to take a pregnancy test, the 2 pink lines felt like a betrayal, hissed closer to me than any secret I could keep. I buried it deep within myself, feeling it claw away at my insides like an unholy creature demanding to be acknowledged, but I shut that part of me off, replaced my shame with an act, a performance of normality as we still hung out, laughed, and did all the things that best friends do, me hiding behind an ever-thickening facade until one dreadful day in October when the truth became too much to bear, and everything spiraled out of my control. I was at school, the world moving around me in a familiar haze, peering at my reflection in the cloudy bathroom stall mirror as I felt the familiar grip of nausea squeeze my throat, only this time it wasn't just the weight of my secret, something in the air shifted, and as I stumbled to the nearest toilet, the urge to retch took hold like a vicious storm. My body reacted violently, and among my chaotic tears, the world turned black and blurry until I was pulled back to reality by icy hands. Someone was screaming, a teacher, the panicked faces of classmates peering in through the bathroom door while I curled up, practically cradling this secret that clawed at the edges of my mind, my blood pounding in my ears. I couldn't let anyone know, couldn't let it change my life, but they pulled me out while I fought to shield my truth like it was my heart itself. And I could only hear their whispers and cries of concern morph into the grating noise of betrayal as I lied and spun a web of half-truths, telling them I'd just had a bad taco or something simple, painfully aware of the razor-edged truth lying beneath the surface. My best friend rushed to my side later, and I could feel the remorse rippling between us like an electrical current, a whirlwind of guilt dancing in the air. It was clear that the secrets we carried morphed into a silent burden that was growing heavier every day, but neither of us dared to speak it. The weeks crawled by until the undeniable truth screamed its presence through crimson-stained fabric that would grow thicker. An unexpected pounding at my door one evening made my heart go cold, and I opened it to find him standing there, weary eyes that mirrored the weight of everything we'd buried. "We need to talk," he said, and as I invited him in, the moment felt like stepping onto a battlefield, and I met him in the living room where I thought the light might save us, but the darkness was relentless. It poured out of my mouth, the truth spilled like an overfilled glass. And in that singular moment, everything shifted. Tears flowed freely as I called out for help. His face twisted with disbelief before it fell away, replaced with sadness, and I could hear the slow clenching of his fists. Our failure to acknowledge this void that had grown between us, one touch igniting the spark of what could have been while monsters of the past began to rattle within me, and I braced for a fight that would lay us bare. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was a whisper, but it tore through me, and I replied, "Because I didn't want to ruin everything we had. I thought you'd hate me." My heart raced, words crashing like waves as the air grew thicker, a brewing storm gathering power around us, and our honesty lifted the veil, revealing the consequences of our actions while leaving us painfully stranded. What do you do when you've lost yourself to a mistake that shapes the very core of who you are? The world outside grew quieter as the depths of our silence stretched, until I found myself staring into those unfathomable eyes, and I saw the flicker of something igniting. Our hearts were racing in sync, but the bond we'd shared was now a tangled mess of fear, obligation, and impending fatherhood. He reached out, gingerly tracing the contours of my cheek, the most comforting of gestures, but the kiss that followed felt like a goodbye and hellos wrapped in one, like two souls realizing they were meant for different paths, and with a broken heart, I did the only thing I could. I stepped back, sealing away the truth of my body. My life twisted in the spirals of a decision I had no control over, knowing I could never change what had happened, and now, I must live with it tucked deep within, far away from prying eyes, hidden among broken memories and shards of what was. I take quick selfies when taking pictures for strangers, and it seems innocuous enough. After all, I'm just a guy with a camera, trying to make the most of my weekends by helping lost tourists capture memories, but something changed that day when I decided to take a photo for a couple at a park festival. They looked so happy, the sun catching the gleam in the woman's eyes, and as I raised my phone to snap the picture, I felt a sudden rush of unease. I could have sworn I saw a shadow flicker just behind them, but when I glanced back, there was nothing but fading autumn leaves spinning in the wind. I brushed it off, focusing through the camera lens to frame the couple perfectly against the vibrant backdrop of the festivities, and when I handed them my phone, their gratitude was genuine, or at least I thought it was until later that night when I scrolled through the pictures and noticed something uncanny. In the background of their photo, just at the edge of the frame, there it was, the same shadow I thought I'd imagined, a dark, elongated figure with limbs that seemed too long, twisting, almost like they weren't bound by human anatomy, and I felt a chill trickle down my spine. Trying to shake off the feeling of dread, I went to bed, but when I tried to sleep, my mind kept replaying the jittery image as I whispered reassurances to calm myself down, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the light or a passing person that I didn't notice, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't help but feel that whatever that thing was, it had been looking right at me. It gnawed at me through the night until I finally decided to go back to the park the next day, just to be sure, just to prove to myself that it was nothing, and with a sense of false courage, I arrived at the bustling festival, my camera swinging at my side, but the moment I walked in, a heavier, indescribable weight settled on my chest. People laughed, children played, and the laughter of families rang out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And it took only an hour of awkward, nervous wandering before I was overwhelmed by the pull of my curiosity. I began capturing more photos of unsuspecting strangers, each time making a quick selfie to document my existence within the day, but every picture came back to me with that same shadow lurking ominously in the background, like a harbinger of dread waiting patiently for something, stalling within the edges of every frame and breaking my spirit little by little. By now, I couldn't function properly. I could feel an urgency drumming in my veins, compelling me to investigate the meaning behind this obsession that had taken root in my thoughts until I stumbled upon a woman selling homemade remedies in a makeshift stall, her eyes bright yet burdened with a depth of knowledge that sent a shiver down my spine as if she was privy to secrets I could never fathom. I approached her hesitantly, feeling foolish for even asking, but I told her about the shadowy figure and how it seemed to be connected to my pictures. To my surprise, she simply smiled condescendingly, as if she were an unsuspecting mother amused by a child's imaginary friend, and she spoke of ancient folklore in a voice that was both soothing and sinister, claiming that shadows like mine are not mere figments but echoes of energy, remnants of souls trapped between the living and the lost. Panic surged through me as I tried to explain that I was just trying to help people preserve their memories, but she cut me off, telling me that sometimes when you capture a moment, you also invite whatever is lurking within it to cross over, to attach itself to you. And all the while I felt my heart racing out of control as she pressed a small, black stone into my palm, telling me it would protect me if I truly wanted to rid myself of the entity that had latched onto me. I thanked her, feeling foolish and grateful in equal measure, and as I left the festival that day, I started to feel the oppressive weight lift ever so slightly, convinced that maybe I had overreacted and that the remedy would shield me from whatever malignant force had been haunting me, but instead, that night, I started having the most vivid dreams. I found myself standing in the park again, only it was dark, and the festival lights twinkled in a disorienting manner, illuminating strangers who were now twisted and ghastly, their faces distorted and unrecognizable as they seemed to dance around me in a frenzy. I turned to run, but before I could make it out, the darkness didn't chase me away, it wrapped around me like a warm blanket, drawing me in, and I could feel the shadow tightening its grip, whispering things I couldn't understand but resonated deep within my core, filling me with rage and despair, until I bolted upright in my bed, gasping for air. My phone buzzed insistently on my nightstand, and it took me a moment to find my bearings. It was a message from the couple, the very ones I had taken the initial photo of, and they thanked me again with a nudge of nostalgia, but out of nowhere, they asked if I noticed anything strange in the pictures, and before I could respond, they sent me a screenshot, a grainy image from the festival where I had taken their picture, but it wasn't the same shadow anymore. This one was gleaming by the edge of their hair, and now it had an undeniable form, a face with hollow eyes and a gaping maw, as though it had only just begun to crawl its way out of the realm between life and death. And in that moment of terror, I dropped my phone in disbelief, realizing all too late that I had not only taken a picture for them, but that I had unwittingly signed a pact. My selfies were no longer just innocent snapshots, they had become a portal, a call to something ancient and dark, and as I stood frozen, staring into the void of my dimly lit room, the shadows crept closer, creeping in with a deadly certainty, and I trembled in realization, knowing that I might have just sealed the fate of all those I had photographed, lost to the inescapable darkness beneath the flickering sun. Ever since college, I've loved messing around with my friends' homes, a ritual that always drew laughter and playful arguments. But when it came to Lisa, she took it personally. Lisa was a marvelous chef with a passion for all things delicious, and she adored her kitchen decor, a vibrant, delightful piece that hung proudly on her wall, spelling out the word yum in oversized, pastel letters. Every time I visited, it was a subtle invitation to enjoy whatever mouth-watering dish she was going to whip up next, but this time, in a bout of mischief, I decided to have a little fun and change her decor to Mum as a joke about her constant calls for so much help in the kitchen. I used Velcro to stick the letters back on, rearranging just enough so they wouldn't fall off before she noticed. It was lighthearted, I thought, a silly way to tease her cooking in the spirit of our friendship, but when Lisa returned home, her laughter faltered, and the look on her face shifted from amusement to confusion, as if she were wrestling with something just out of reach. "It's just a joke, relax," I said, but she merely gave a puzzled smile before looking toward the kitchen window, where shadows danced uneasily in the mid-afternoon light. I tried not to let her change in demeanor ruin my fun, so I offered to help her prepare dinner, hoping to distract us both from the awkward moment. The sun began its descent, casting elongated shadows that crept up the walls, but even as we laughed and cooked, I sensed something was off. A strange silence hung over us, punctuated only by the soft clinking of pots and pans, and the smell of onions sizzling in butter seemed to deepen every sigh and chuckle until they all felt heavy with a weight I couldn't understand. That instinct, that discomfort, lingered with us well into the night, and Lisa's turns became more erratic. She had mentioned a friend who carved out personalized decor from the local forest but dismissed it as folklore, and I brushed it off too, yet the whispers of something ancient loomed in the shadows, as if the very wood that adorned her walls had ears, and I couldn't help but notice the letters on the wall didn't quite look the same, the colors darker, and the edges almost jagged. Hours passed, and after we finished a wonderful meal filled with laughter and vibrant chatter, I decided to head home, but not before turning back for one last look at that yum that had somehow become muddled in my mind. That was when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rise from the letters themselves, a soft mmm vibrating through the kitchen that sent a chill skittering down my spine. I didn't think much more of it. The echoes of joke and friendship filled my mind, washing away the rising dread, but as I got into bed that night, I replayed the look on Lisa's face when she had first seen the letters. In the coming days, I noticed Lisa was different. Always alert, always jumpy, refusing to stay in the kitchen alone. Checking the blinds at odd hours almost as if expecting something to peer back at her. I brushed off her fears at first, insisting it was just the silliness of rearranging her decor, but her eyes, dark and round, carried a hint of franticness that sank heavy in my gut. Strange happenings began to invade her home. She spoke of hearing whispering beyond the walls, something that came alive in the dead of night, something that called her back to those letters. I found it all a little outrageous until one night, craving to shake this growing anxiety off like a heavy cloak, I decided to visit unannounced, drenched in an unusual concern only to find the lights off, every curtain drawn tightly, the air thick with an unnameable tension. I knocked softly, but as the sound echoed back, I swore I could hear a reply, a whisper that came just below the level of comprehension. Hesitating, I turned the knob, shocked to find it unlocked, and upon stepping inside, the darkness was barely penetrated by the street light filtering through the gaps. In stark contrast to the familiar, cheerful atmosphere, I felt a pulse, a resonating energy that vibrated with sheer malevolence. It took my breath away. The kitchen felt warped, disfigured, and my eyes shot to the wall adorned with the letters that had once invoked laughter. Now they seemed to breathe, swirling in shadows like some ancient rune consumed in silence. And that whisper, it swelled, a dissonant melody of voices vibrating, layering upon one another, forming words that reached into my brain, echoing, "Mum," drawn out like a sinister lullaby seeking to cradle me in darkening enmity. Panic swelled as Lisa's frantic calls echoed in my head, the way she'd spun tales of a curse that entangled anyone foolhardy enough to play with the words that bound and sought to bring forth nightmares steeped in the abyss beyond. In disbelief, I stumbled back, and the revelation crashed over me like a tide. This was no harmless prank. I had summoned this curse upon her walls. I ran then, the echoes of her name falling from my lips, only to trip over my own feet, soaring past deeper fears taking root in the very shadows of her home, cascading down alleys of guilt as I heard the chanting growing stronger behind me. "Mum, Mum," they cried, until every syllable dug claws into my back, choking the air from my lungs. I caught sight of her, standing by the letters, those dreadful decorations pulsating like the heart of a living being, swaying gently as though beckoning to claim her soul. Lisa's eyes found mine, wide and fraught with terror, as she raised a trembling hand, trembling beneath the unrelenting grasp of ancient words. I could see it then, the unfurling shadow that gnawed hungrily at her pulse, bathing her in twilight as the letters contorted, enacting some grim design. I couldn't scream, no sound escaped as her gaze turned hollow, pulling me into her torment as the darkness closed in like a vice. With a final breath, she whispered, "You shouldn't have messed with my yum." And in that instant, I fell into the others, the whispers swirling, pulling me into the unknown, and the letters hummed, age-old questions reverberating in the darkness, echoing through eternity as the last thing I heard was her laughter melding into the abyss, a warped melody of welcomed madness. I was tipsy visiting in New Orleans before a carnival cruise and found myself wandering the cobbled streets, all mischief and music, with the vibrant energy of the city making my head spin just as much as the whiskey I'd been drinking. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a violet shadow across the French Quarter, and the air was thick with the scent of deep-fried everything and the sweet, sticky allure of beignets. I hadn't planned on straying far from my friends, but the intoxicating rhythms of jazz pulled me like a magnet, so I stumbled into a dimly lit bar that seemed to hum with secrets. The place felt like a relic, filled with an odd assortment of locals sharing knowing laughs, their eyes glinting with mischief. I ordered a hurricane, its neon orange liquid promising both delight and trouble as I melted into a corner booth, the melodies swirling around me. It was in this haze of laughter and music that I met her, a woman draped in layers of beads and unexplainable charm, her voice a sultry whisper that melted into the jazz notes. She had a name, Celia, one that I barely registered amidst the haze, and with every sip, the world faded into the background until it was just the two of us. Before long, she became an intoxicating mystery I was eager to unravel, telling stories about the city, ghosts that danced in the streets, haunting tales of lovers lost and found in the parades, and a cult that supposedly thrived below the city's surface, lurking in the shadows of the alleys. Each laugh we shared sent my heart racing as I felt a wild urge to be reckless, to explore the edges of reality with her. As the night deepened, she leaned closer, her breath warm against my ear, urging me to follow her out into the vibrant chaos of Bourbon Street. I knew I should have called it a night, should have returned to my hotel, but something about her, perhaps the promise of adventure, compelled me to tag along. The streets were alive, a wild circus of revelers, and each step we took together seemed to bind us deeper into something unspoken. As we passed a few street performers, Celia grabbed my hand and pulled me into a small dark alley just off the path, her laughter bubbling up like champagne, or maybe it was panic, I could hardly tell anymore. The alley was narrow, lit by the flickering light of a single, dying street lamp, and it felt like we were stepping into another world. Suddenly, the laughter faded, replaced by a chilling edge in the air, and a sudden doubt prickled my senses. I turned to say something, to break the spell that had bound me, but she was gone, vanished like smoke in the wind, leaving only the echo of her laughter at the back of my mind. My heart raced, thrumming in my chest as I stumbled back into the street, trying to find my bearings, but the world around me felt warped, the colors too vivid, the people too distorted. It was then, amidst the thumping bass of a nearby parade, that I noticed a figure lingering at the edge of the crowd, cloaked in shadows. His features were shrouded, but I could feel his gaze boring into me, cold and unyielding. I should have run, should have called for help, but curiosity nudged me closer, my gut twisted with a mix of thrill and trepidation. He gestured for me to come closer, an impossibly slow wave of his arm as he beckoned me deeper into the thrumming street chaos, and against my better judgment, I approached. It was as if a spell had been cast, I couldn't pull away. "You've met her, haven't you?" he whispered, his voice low and laced with something sinister. A shiver crawled down my spine, and I nodded, suddenly aware of the danger in my ignorance. He leaned in, his breath reeking of something rotten, and his words sliced through the carnival sounds around us. "You shouldn't have followed her. She's been waiting for you." Panic surged through me as I struggled to comprehend the implications of his words. Around me, the carnival carried on with unabated fervor, but within my mind, a storm brewed. I turned to dart back, to find my friends, but the streets had morphed into a labyrinth. I was lost. I pushed through the crowd, every laugh and cheer now felt tainted, distorted echoes of joy that only reminded me of the eerie heaviness of the stranger's claim. Frantically, I stumbled through the throngs of masked figures, trying to shake off the feeling that invisible threads were tugging me toward the shadows at the edge of the festivities. Somewhere in the back of my mind, memories of Celia danced like phantoms, her haunting eyes drawing me closer to the truth I didn't want to uncover. Just as I thought I had lost all hope of escape, I caught sight of her, weaving through the crowd with an eerie smile that sent chills racing along my spine. It was as if she had settled back into her place, inviting me in, but the thrill of the night was replaced by a sense of dread clattering in my heart. I shouldn't have felt drawn to her, something was wrong. I was screaming in my mind, trying to shout over the pounding of the jazz band that had somehow morphed into a discordant symphony, but my body betrayed me, propelling me forward until I reached out, caught her wrist, but she turned to face me, and for a heartbeat, it felt like time froze. Celia's eyes glowed. It wasn't the vibrant warmth I had felt before, but a cold emptiness filled with soulless promises and dark curiosities. "Are you ready to see?" she cooed, her voice layered with something sinister. Every instinct in me screamed to run, yet my feet remained rooted in place, my heart a prisoner of her gaze. "What do you mean?" I breathed, my voice barely a whisper against the howling wind that swept through the street. "I'll show you," she replied, and with that, the thrumming chaos dissolved around us, the music faded, and the streets warped into a surreal tunnel, the colors bleeding into one another as darkness clawed at the edges of my consciousness. The air crackled with tension, the sounds drowned in surreal silence as I realized we weren't in New Orleans anymore. We were somewhere else, somewhere dark and twisted, where the shadows breathed and whispered secrets of what was to come. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me whole was Celia smiling, a smile that chilled my bones and felt like a promise of despair, and in that moment, I understood I had stumbled into something far beyond my understanding, lost to the rhythm of a night too wild to escape. When I woke again, it was alone, in a vacant room on the cruise ship, with no memory of how I got there or what had happened that night, but the feeling that something had followed me remained, lurking in the corners of my mind like a haunting melody I couldn't shake. I've always been good at pretending, and it became a skill I put to use more than ever when I found myself in a financial bind, unable to afford breakfast most mornings, so I snuck into the local Hilton under the pretense of being a guest. The lobby was everything you'd expect, polished marble floors and the faint scent of fresh linens that hinted at comfort, but what I looked forward to most was the breakfast bar, a lavish spread that made your stomach rumble in anticipation. I dressed the part, complete with a blazer salvaged from a thrift store and a shiny wristwatch I had found at a garage sale, allowing me to slip in with the traveling business folk who seemed oblivious to my presence among them. At first, it was exciting, watching the other guests fill their plates with flaky pastries and fresh fruit as I nibbled on a muffin, pretending to read my phone to avoid arousing suspicion. Day by day, I became more brazen, sampling the sausage and slathering butter on my bagels, halfway through a meal made from someone else's expense account when I thought I caught the eye of the lady behind the front desk. Her gaze lingered on me, a frown creasing her face for just a moment, before she focused again on a computer screen. I chalked it up to paranoia, but I felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into the pit of my stomach, the stirring of unease. I continued my charade, but this particular hotel had a way of feeling eerie, from the dimly lit hallways to the strange absence of other guests as I moved toward the elevator with my plate piled high. I felt like a ghost, haunting the lavish spaces that felt surreal in their opulence. One morning, as I reached for another helping of scrambled eggs, I noticed a man watching me, his eyes narrowed and piercing as though dissecting every detail of my not-so-polished disguise. I turned back to my plate, heart racing, trying to ignore the sense of dread that threatened to spiral into panic. Then he spoke, a low rumble that set my teeth on edge. "You don't belong here." The words hung heavy between us, and I forced a laugh, trying to downplay the situation. I was just about to brush past him when he held out a business card, the embossed silver lettering gleaming against the backdrop of the breakfast bar. "You'll want to keep this," he insisted, his voice a creeping whisper. I pocketed the card, curiosity piqued, but as I walked away I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just accepted a ticking time bomb. That evening, I found myself tearing the card from my pocket, half wanting to discard it, half drawn to whatever secret it held. My fingers danced over the smooth surface, and finally, I dialed the number printed. A voice answered, low and gravelly, "You should have stayed away." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I hung up immediately, dismissing it as nothing but a prank. Yet I kept going back to the hotel, guilt gnawing at my insides as I indulged in their lavish breakfast and racked up a growing sense of dread. Days turned into a week, and I kept my head down, avoiding the man. I didn't even remember his face anymore, just the haunting presence that lingered in my mind's eye. Until one morning, I walked into the dining area and froze. The hotel staff had changed. The once friendly faces were replaced with expressionless employees, all wearing the same steely gaze that made my stomach drop. I set my plate down, feeling the unwelcome awareness settle over me, a weight I could no longer ignore. Instead of food, I saw the looks, the suspicion, the judgment, sharp enough to etch the air with tension. I was out of options, headed to the exit, when the woman from the front desk blocked my path, her gaze unwavering as she leaned in a little too close. "You've made a mistake," she whispered, her voice smooth like silk but laden with malice. "You don't need to pretend anymore, you should know that we see you." Panic surged through my veins, the laughter and murmurs of the dining room faded into a sinister silence. I turned and bolted, my heart pounding like a wild drum in my chest, racing through the maze of the hotel's hallways where I felt pursued by shadows. I slipped outside, the cool air biting at my skin, the sunlight blinding as I struggled to breathe. I didn't stop running until my legs begged for mercy, far from the deceptive comfort of the Hilton. I was a fraud, a ghost haunting a world that wasn't mine, and the worst part was that even though I left, I could feel them looking for me. Days passed, and every corner I turned felt shadowed by unseen eyes. I couldn't shake the fear that they were searching for me, those unfriendly staff members whose faces morphed into unrecognizable horrors in the edges of my mind. I fought to reclaim normalcy, fearful of the breakfast I had once craved, but with every morning, I was paralyzed by the memory of their stares. I didn't dare return to that hotel, yet one night as I counted sheep, I heard the buzzing of my phone, an unknown number appearing on the screen. My heart lurched as I answered, the same low, gravelly voice from before ringing out, "We found you. You need to come back." I slammed the phone down, mind racing with panic, but a chilling dread settled in as the memories of those breakfasts, that card, and the man resurfaced like a tidal wave crashing over me, visceral and relentless. I bought a train ticket to anywhere, a desperate plunge, hoping the farther I ran, the safer I'd become, until I realized I was only making things worse as I boarded the train bound north, not knowing that I was walking straight into their trap, where breakfast would no longer be a buffet of pastries but an omen, where there would be no escape from the hotel that had devoured so many, just another line added to a long list of vanished guests who came for breakfast and disappeared without a trace. So if you're ever in town and see the Hilton, take care not to join the throngs of well-dressed guests, because beneath the surface of indulgence lies a darkness that could swallow you whole, and there's a chance you'll never leave that breakfast bar after all. And if you hear my voice whispering through the air or catch a glimpse of me watching from the corner of the room, it's too late, you've been served. When I received the invitation to the pool party from Sasha, a social media influencer known for her extravagant gatherings, I felt a rush of excitement alongside the inevitable twinge of doubt. I didn't really know her, though we shared a few mutual friends, and I imagined we'd be sipping cocktails by the glimmering water, surrounded by laughter and music. The day of the party, I donned my best swimsuit, something vibrant enough to catch an eye but simple enough to blend in, as I arrived at her sprawling suburban mansion, where the twinkling lights hung from the palm trees like whimsical stars, casting a warm glow on a crowd buzzing with chatter. As I stepped onto the patio, I was met by the smell of sunscreen mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, an earthy, almost sour aroma that set my nerves on edge as the laughter picked up and a faint sound of splashing echoed from the pool, but I shrugged it off, diving into the mingling and pretending I belonged. About an hour in, my stomach twisted in a sudden wave of nausea. I thought maybe it was the shrimp cocktail I'd indulged in a bit too eagerly, so I excused myself to the bathroom, desperately hoping to alleviate the discomfort. It was then I noticed the sign above the toilet, "Please do not flush anything but toilet paper," and I couldn't help but feel a creeping unease in the pit of my stomach as I obeyed the rules, wary of what anything might mean in a home where guests clearly followed no discernible hygiene standards. The insipid laughter outside morphed into a cacophony of whoops and yells as some guests engaged in drunken pool games, but a sickly sweet smell wafted in from the open window, making me recoil. I couldn't pinpoint the scent, but it felt wrong, almost like my instincts were screaming at me to get out. When I rejoined the party, I'd hoped my discomfort would fade, but more and more, I noticed the guests reaching for the buffet and barely managing a smile as they tucked into molded cakes and charred hot dogs. Their faces warped slightly as laughter rang out, but behind their eyes was a glimmer of something darker, a shared secret that whispered from one guest to the next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the laughter fading into something with sharper edges, when I caught a group of girls crowded around Sasha, pointing, their giggles morphing into wild shrieks of delight that were somehow vicious. I stepped closer, my heart pounding as I leaned in, desperate to catch a glimpse of whatever had caught their interest. Alas, the sight left me paralyzed. Floating grotesquely in the pool, unnoticed by the oblivious revelers, was a murky swirl, a mass of putrid brown, trailing like a vile ribbon through the water. Panic gripped me, and I took a step back. Did they notice? Didn't they see it? I whispered to myself while trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, but every time I stole a glance, the horrid mass grew larger, its revolting viscosity undulating, taunting me as I felt bile rise in my throat. Suddenly, as if commanded by an unseen force, a few partygoers lured Sasha into the pool, and as they splashed about, their laughter turned into wild shrieks as the surface of the water erupted. The mass began to break apart, horrifyingly, and without any warning, a soft cloud of odor billowed up, wrapping around those careless partygoers, forcing them to stop in their tracks. What happened next was indescribable. It was a slow-motion moment where realization dawned, reflected in each face that had once been joyful, eyes going wide in horror as they recoiled from the foul stench now filling the air and churning the festal atmosphere into something terrifying as they splashed and scrambled blindly out of the water. But instead of panic audible, their laughter returned falsely, layered with manic joy as they realized what lay just beneath the surface. Screams erupted as more of the guests caught wind of the pungent reality about what had just emerged from the depths of the pool, the sound borderline ecstatic with a touch of primal fear. Sasha, however, didn't seem to mind. If anything, it seemed to fuel her wildness, because in her gleeful dance around the pool, she beckoned others to join, and that was when I caught a glimpse of something even darker in her expression, a glint akin to madness. I felt frozen, repulsed yet inexplicably enthralled as the guests dived back into the pool, laughing, not just out of fright but something far more exhilarating. One by one, they submerged themselves in the filth, sloshing around, as if they were high on the thrill of the taboo, ignoring the utter mess the water had become, convinced perhaps that it was part of the show, the night turning chaotic, desperate, and I just couldn't shake the feeling of having stepped into a nightmare that blurred the line between horror and sanctioned revelry. I turned to escape, only to find the patio packed tighter than before. People were laughing with abandon, and yet, a shadow passed over my heart as I caught Sasha's gaze locked onto me, a predator sizing up prey, manic joy reflecting back at me as if I were now part of their grotesque game, and as I stumbled backward, colliding with another guest, I realized there was no exit in sight. The laughter spiraled into something else, filled with the stench of something lost to reason. I hurried past the thrumming music, unable to swallow the reality that I had been lured into something twisted, a gathering gone wrong, but I still held on to the faint hope that I could amble my way back to freedom. The last tendrils of merriment faded into laughter that echoed ominously as I darted toward the edge of the pool, nightmares stirring around me, drowning in a fatal tide of laughter while I desperately clawed at the resin wrap of my sanity, knowing only that whatever mad party this was, it had become a twisted performance of the grotesque while I became the outsider watching as, to my horror, the party transformed into what felt like a crude ritual of acceptance, a cacophony of cheers rising above as I flailed toward the exit, realizing too late I had come to the wrong kind of party, one where they weren't merely pretending to revel in the chaos but had surrendered to it entirely, becoming entranced in something I couldn't fathom, and for them, it was the beginning of a ritual that made the horrors of the world pale in comparison. And in my panic to escape, among the forgotten stains of laughter, the realization hit me hard. To them, this was the best party ever, and perhaps that was the scariest part of it all. Once invited, you could never truly leave. I've been hiding a massive secret from my parents for the last 3 years, one that has grown heavier with the burden of keeping it from them. You see, it began innocently enough when I discovered a niche online community that played intense pranks and dared each other to do increasingly outrageous things for cash. It was a world filled with adrenaline junkies, and every post I read ignited something inside of me. I started small, joining a few of the challenges and sharing what I could do. The stunts were wild but harmless, like doing embarrassing things in public places, which soon turned into escalating dares that required more than just guts. With each video I posted, the views swelled, and so did my bank account. My parents had no idea that the extra cash they saw me flaunting was built on the back of a daring digital persona I created named the Masked Phantom, who became an underground sensation. I was pulling in thousands each month, but the catch was that I was supposed to keep the channel anonymous. I did everything I could to obscure my identity, using face masks and disguises, and it worked, until one night when a prank I thought was harmless went horribly, horribly wrong. For a special Halloween episode, I decided to stage a haunted house in an abandoned warehouse, enticing my followers to unlock hidden challenges throughout the night. Hundreds flocked to witness the epic chaos I intended to unleash, with fog machines and eerie sound effects creating a perfect atmosphere. What I hadn't expected, however, was for an actual homeless man to have taken shelter in one of the corners, and when the fog rolled in, and the screams erupted, panic ensued. Nobody was prepared for the chaos that followed. The man was terrified, stumbling backward as I jumped out in my witch costume, thinking it was all in good fun. He tripped and hit his head on the wall, hard. By the time police arrived, I was gone. I was just this kid who played this funny masked character all online. But the views soared, my followers were mesmerized by the twisted tale, and I posted a video saying the man had disappeared, adding to the thrill. I suppressed the guilt, unable to halt the rush of cash pouring in and the excitement of my growing fame, but about a month later, I got a message, someone claiming they knew what happened that night. They demanded payment for their silence. At first, I was ready to ignore it, but then came the follow-ups, creeping closer and closer, more intense, more personal, often detailing things only someone at my doorstep would know. I took to deleting my online presence, pulling off the masked phantom like an old skin I was growing out of, but I'd already made tens of thousands and enjoyed a lifestyle that was beyond my wildest dreams. But what started as fun turned into paranoia. I neglected my schoolwork, stopped hanging out with friends, and my once cheerful home turned into a cat-and-mouse game with an unseen pursuer. I thought my luck might be changing when I met Jessica, a fellow student who shared my love for thrill-seeking adventures. She was everything I looked for, beautiful, clever, and fearless. We began dating, and I saw a glimmer of hope, maybe even a way to share my secret, until one night while sitting on a park bench, she asked if I'd ever been in trouble before. The question sent a chill racing up my spine, and in that moment, the weight of the secret felt unbearable. I froze, the truth weighing on my tongue like a stone, but I shrugged it off and told her no, knowing full well the response that would elicit if I opened that floodgate. As our relationship deepened, my deception clawed at my insides. I wanted to trust her, but I couldn't risk losing her or letting the truth slip out, especially with warnings still flooding my DMs. A few weeks later, I walked into my room to find a note pinned to my door, "Told you I'd find you. That man belonged to someone, and now they're onto you. I need more if you want to stay safe." The message felt like a death warrant, and an overwhelming dread gripped my heart. I couldn't afford to back down, this was all slipping out of control. A part of me wanted to run away, disappear without a trace, but with Jessica now invested in my life, I couldn't bring myself to do it. By winter, the spiral of fear clashed with my yearning for freedom and security, but the final blow came the day after Christmas. It was a usual family gathering, laughter filling the air, smelling of gingerbread and hot cocoa. I was fine until a familiar face appeared at the front door, the homeless man. I froze. He was dirty, gaunt, with eyes clouded by the shadows of his past. The moment I realized he was alive, my heart raced. My parents didn't recognize him, but they offered him food and shelter. "Please, don't send me back," he spoke, his voice breaking. My stomach turned. I wanted to scream, to confess everything, but instead, I acted like a coward, standing there paralyzed. I watched as he began to share a fragmented story of his journey, and all I could think of was how to run back to my dark sanctuary, away from the reality I had created. I wanted to deny my involvement, delete all those videos and pretend I was just a scared kid before it all spiraled, but it didn't matter now. The truth was right in front of me, threatening to crash my world of deception down in an instant. By the end of the night, he vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, and I felt a heavy weight lifted, only to be crushed beneath the guilt that fogged my mind. I tried to salvage my relationship with Jessica. We went out to dinner, and when I looked into her eyes, I could see the concern lurking beneath the surface. She knew I was keeping something from her, and with each innocent inquiry about my life, I felt myself sinking deeper. I failed to mention the absence of my online presence or the terror that invaded my mind daily. Then, one day, the last straw came. Jessica pulled up a news article detailing a series of threats made against the masked phantom, including mine, and she turned to me with disbelief. "Is this you?" When I hesitated, the grief in her eyes was enough to shatter my heart. "You lied to me." She stepped back, and the betrayal struck like a lightning bolt. I could feel everything unraveling, just like the life I had crafted around me. I was lost, frozen in a tempest of guilt, shame, and terror. Then, the final twist, when I turned to leave, a crackling text came through my phone, a single image meant just for me, the headline "Where is the masked phantom?" Next to it was the picture of my parents, smiles radiant. The message read, "Remember, they love you too." I felt my stomach churn, realizing it wasn't just my life on the line, it was theirs. The walls closed in, and my entire existence crumbled under the weight of secrets, lies, and the tightly wound string of chaos I had mixed into the life I hadn't known could be painted so perfectly sinister until now. And as I sat there with my heart in my throat, grappling with unimaginable dread for them, I realized, somewhere amidst the blizzard of emotions, that I was truly, horrifyingly, all alone. My roommate, Klaus, came to me with a story, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of revealing something no one else knew. He pulled out a dark, tattered German flag, Its once vivid colors faded and fraying at the edges, claiming it was a family heirloom with a history that was darker than any folklore. Klaus, with his slight German accent, said it was from a relative who had been involved in some grim historical events that he never quite elaborated on. Naturally, curiosity got the better of me, and I took the flag off his hands for a few weeks, using it in the most debauched ways possible. My friends and I threw wild parties where it served as a backdrop for our drunken shenanigans, spilled drinks, and sweaty bodies grinding to music that muddled our senses. It was during one of those chaos-filled nights, with the bass thumping through the walls and laughter echoing down the halls, that I first noticed something strange, a low hum that seemed to ebb from the flag itself, growing unbearable whenever I touched it for too long. My fascination morphed into obsession, prompting me to take the thing out and hang it above my bed, convinced it would bring me fortune and prowess in my exploits. That night, I began to have vivid dreams, lucid dreams where the surface of the flag turned into a portal, and I felt as if I were pulled into another realm, one where shadows danced on the fringes of my vision while whispers echoed through the darkness, sinister and alluring. I laughed it off as mere intoxication, of course, but the more I used the flag in my reckless pursuits, the more it seemed alive, as if it fed off my energy, amplifying my wildest fantasies and darkest urges. With each passing day, I found myself descending deeper down a rabbit hole, abandoning my once cherished friendships and leaving parties behind in favor of private ceremonies with nothing but the flag for company. I would drape it over myself, seeking comfort in its weight, while the whispers grew louder. They compelled me to partake in increasingly bizarre rituals, which led me to pull out the dagger I always kept buried in my desk drawer, a relic from my grandfather with its own shady backstory, and I carved my initials into the fabric, watching as the blood soaked into the threads, curious about what power I might awaken. I felt exhilarated, my senses sharpened, clarity flooded me as the flag absorbed my essence, but the pleasure spiraled into something more profound and horrifying. Friends started to suspect something was off. My roommate warned me that I was changing, but he had no idea, no inkling of the force I had unleashed. In the darkest corners of my room, I could make out shadowy figures just beyond the limelight, waiting and watching with hungry eyes. The nights morphed into strange configurations where I seemed to lose all sense of self, morphing into something unrecognizable. The flag whispered its dark secrets, it told me of an awful power, one that granted its bearer dominion over the darkest parts of the human experience. I was drawn to it, even as I felt my sanity fraying like the edges of the sacrificial cloth I had come to revere. The whispers demanded offerings, and that hunger became insatiable after I lost track of time and reality. My friends vanished, one by one, rumors of ill fortune spiraling out like the smoke from the incense that filled my room. Klaus stopped coming around, and the last time I saw him, he looked horrified, warning me to destroy the flag, that it was cursed, a method for something ancient and evil to slip through the cracks of our world. But I brushed him off, laughing, until the borders of my life disintegrated altogether. It was 2 weeks later when I awoke one morning to find blood on the flag, thick, dark, and pooling, my hands stained crimson from where I had pressed them against the image of German soldiers marching through dreams bizarre and malignant. The whispers crescendoed into frenzied chants as I tore the flag down, but the sounds didn't stop, they wrapped around my mind, forming a noose tightening around my sanity. I didn't know what to do. I sought help, but every night propelled me deeper into the web of malevolent energies that warped my perception. It was one late night, when shadows loomed closer than ever, that I finally confronted the flag, trembling and terrified, ready to set it ablaze in an act of desperation. But the moment I reached for my lighter, it went out, plunging my room into darkness where the chorus of whispers drowned any remnants of courage I had remaining. The last thing I felt was the flag wrapping around my throat, pulling me close as the darkness suffocated me, and in that blackout, I was aware of a profound misery. You see, the flag didn't just capture some memories, it bound souls, spiriting them away into its seething depths, and I realized too late that I had become its newest vessel. Every party I held, every friend I ensnared, every drop of blood spilled had fed into the ominous spell it held. After that, I understand now, its surface turned shiny and new again, every tattered edge sewn together, and Klaus's warning never left my mind. I'm still here, trapped in the fabric of the flag, wandering in the shadows as time twists around me, unable to escape the sickening rush of power that whispers in my ear, telling me to find someone else, someone worthy enough to carry on the cycle. But what frightens me the most is the realization that it can only be one person at a time, and I wonder if you're the one I need to seduce next as a new host for its dark legacy. I don't think my dad is actually my biological dad, and it took me far too long to realize it, Maybe I was too naive or too conditioned to accept everything that happened around me as normal. Growing up, I had always felt a strange disconnect, as though I was watching my life unfold through a glass barrier while everyone around me glided seamlessly through their roles. My mom, immersed in her cooking and her laughter, my little sister, joyfully bounding after butterflies in our sprawling backyard, and then my dad, a steady figure, but one who always seemed to have an air of secrecy about him. The first time I questioned it was at a family reunion when I was around 10. I overheard my aunts whispering about how I looked nothing like him. They tittered nervously and then changed the subject as my dad approached. "What do you mean?" I nervously laughed, a little too loud, the ice in my soda clinking against the plastic cup, but suddenly I felt a wave of fear wash over me, an instinctual recognition that I needed to be vigilant. The years drifted by, and in the little things, a crooked smile that didn't seem to match his, a penchant for potato salad that made me wrinkle my nose, my uncertainties expanded, yet I brushed them aside. I was a decent student, always bucking against my passion for the arts in favor of the solid foundation of academics, and it was in my sophomore year of college that a simple DNA test altered the course of my life forever. I remember sitting in my dorm room, nervously tapping my fingers against the wooden desk as the results flashed on screen. Every word felt like the detonation of a bomb in my world. The screen displayed that my father wasn't my biological dad, and the seconds that ticked away in bewilderment turned into an eternity. The weight of the knowledge clung to me, a weight mixed with fear and an inexplicable compulsion to uncover the truth, shoving me deep into a rabbit hole I didn't know was there. Armed with my laptop and a burning desire to unearth fragments of my past, I began an intrusive exploration, first tracing the family lineage, poring over old photographs, visiting my grandparents, who struggled to make eye contact with me as I asked about my dad's birth. Each layer I peeled back dulled the colors of my childhood memories until at last, an old box in my parents' attic caught my eye, addressed to me in my mother's flowing handwriting. My heart dove as I wrestled the box free from the cobwebbed corners. Inside were faded papers, crumpled medical documents, and a journal that reeked of mothballs and secrets. I started reading, my breath shallow, when the truth slithered to the surface like a dark, bloated worm. My mother, faced with a medical condition that made natural conception impossible, had resorted to an anonymous donor, and while my heart slammed against my ribs, a deeper unease crept in. I discovered references to a child, my child, who had gone missing shortly after birth, and my shallow breaths quickened into panicked gasps. I stumbled upon a name, the name of a man whose photo had been tucked away between the pages, my twin brother. The more I searched, the more layers of ambiguity unfurled. My cell phone buzzed as I stood frozen, revealing a call from my dad, and for a moment, I thought I might hear his normal voice, but something told me to ignore him. I was drawn deeper, navigating through databases, forums, and social media groups obsessively searching for anyone who'd known my brother. I learned that he had vanished without a trace in the summer of '98, just a few days after the adoption paperwork had been filed, and with every new detail, I felt a hollow echo filling my psyche. Fearing the possible ramifications, my heart ablaze with anxiety, I decided it was time to confront my dad. Sitting across from him at the kitchen table again felt surreal. He was the same man I had spent my childhood idolizing, yet I couldn't bear to see him as anything other than a shadow now. "Dad," I began, my voice trembling like a sheet of paper caught in the wind, "who is my biological father?" His face turned to granite, and in that instant, I watched the life leave his eyes, nerves crackling between us like a live wire. When he finally opened his mouth, the truth was so unexpected that it felt like knives twisting beneath my skin. "You're not supposed to know. It wasn't meant to come out like this." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet, and in that moment, I understood I was not just some kid with a forgotten story, I was the keeper of a truth too painful to bear, and nestled within it lay the shadows of an unspeakable reality that I could not have anticipated. It was in that moment, sitting half-lit by the dull fluorescent kitchen light, that the unspoken realization dripped down coldly on my spine. My dad might have been living under some sorts of delusions, or worse, he had been lying to protect me from something monstrous lurking in the dark corners of our past, inevitable and visceral. I knew, suddenly, that I had to escape it all, this fragile life I had clung to, the forced smiles my dad wore, the aching void left by absent truths came crashing down like dominoes, but as I prepared to run, the truth settled between us. My dad wasn't just lying about my origins, he was lying about the darkness that consumed the family before I had even arrived, the truth that buried itself in the past. I suddenly felt a wave of nausea wash over me, awareness crashing like waves. What happened to Bill was suffocatingly real. The next day, I snuck back into my parents' attic, desperate for the answers that seemed just beyond reach, where I discovered more files marked in shades of neglect. I came across police reports and photographs that made my breath itch in my throat. One haunting image shook me to my core, a familiar face, a boy with my eyes, staring back in a missing persons flyer that rotted in the foil-lined box, my brother, flesh, blood, and the vibrant fear I had buried in my psyche. I dug deeper, piecing together a timeline that laid bare the cruel machinations of fate. It turned out my dad wasn't just a protective figure, he had orchestrated my entire existence to shield me from the truth, and as they say, the sins of the father linger long after the last breath. My dad might love me, but he had introduced a reality to my life so tragically twisted. As night crept in around me, so did the shadows of realization. I felt the ghastly pull of this buried lineage, a haunting desire to find my brother or confront the darkness behind his disappearance. Armed with information gleaned from desperate hours online, I ended the night with not just a plan but a frenzy. I was determined to unearth the reality, and perhaps even find my brother, before it swallowed me whole. The thrill of this quest filled me like wildfire. But as I drove into the dark night, with the last remnants of my family life flickering disproportionately in my rearview mirror, an understanding blossomed in the chasms of my heart, a darkness intertwined with love, hauntingly familial, held secrets that could unravel the very fabric of any semblance of normalcy I had ever known, and with every mile between me and home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, a predator lurking in the facade of familiar territory. I still remember that week in the second grade as if it were yesterday, the anxious whispers of my classmates, the smell of crayons, and the way the sun filtered through the dusty windows of our classroom, creating patterns on the floor. It started on a Tuesday when two women in crisp black suits entered our room, their serious faces clashing with the colorful chaos of our environment. They had clipboards in hand, and while the teacher explained they were there to observe, our giggles faded into bewilderment, the air thick with a kind of tension I can't quite articulate. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another routine visit from adults with a penchant for paperwork, but as days wore on, I felt an unshakable weight on my small shoulders, like the whole room turned its eyes to me whenever I dared to raise my hand. The women would scribble notes while glancing my way, their expressions inscrutable, as if my every movement was the subject of a fierce debate I wasn't privy to. My friends started to avoid me, whispering about how it felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't help but feel they were right. During recess, I sat alone on the swings, swinging higher than I should have, hoping the wind would carry away my unease. But when I looked to the side, there they were, standing by the fence, their eyes locked on me, and something in their gaze made me want to shrivel up and disappear. I began to notice small things. My papers were missing, replaced with hastily drawn stick figures with my name scratched at the bottom, and one day I found a note taped to my lunch: "You're special, and you need to be careful." I crept back into the classroom, paranoid, halting my breaths with each squeak of the floorboards, convinced the women were somehow orchestrating this strange circus, and that they knew more about me than I did myself. My teacher, Miss Reynolds, seemed oblivious to my distress, a swirling miasma of obliviousness and genuine joy, but I saw him shudder when he caught one of those piercing stares aimed at him, a tiny inflection in his smile that whispered uncertainties he couldn't voice, out of fear, maybe. As the week crept into Friday, dread settled into my bones, a cold familiarity that urged me to leave the school and never return. I remember the last day, sweltering in the summertime light, when I finally approached the clipboards, heart racing, an intrepid explorer challenging a grand mystery. "Why do you keep looking at me?" I stuttered, and the air crackled with a sudden silence that swallowed the laughter of kids heading for the doors. The taller woman smiled, a tight, disconcerting smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "We just want to know more about you. You've been chosen," she said, and the finality of her words seemed to spin the room off its axis. Suddenly, Miss Reynolds was beside me, placing a protective hand on my shoulder, her expression fierce and pleading, but the women didn't flinch. They remained, unwavering as stone, their attention impenetrable. As I fled the room, a primal instinct rising, I was followed by the echo of my own footsteps, and outside, Miss Reynolds shouted for me to stop, her voice mingling with the laughter of children, but it all melted into a cacophony of sound that only deepened my flight. I didn't stop until I was in the familiar embrace of home, a sanctuary I thought would exist forever, but nothing felt safe anymore. After I shared my experience, my mom just laughed, persuading me that adults could be long-faced from doing serious work and that I was imagining things. But I knew in my heart that fear was real, even if I was alone in it, a lone ship in a sea of indifference. A lingering dread drilled deep into my psyche, becoming a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of light, guiding every choice I made afterward. I stopped sharing my art, began to cut off friendships as if they were vines choking the air, and for years, I kept my head low in words to myself, afraid that they would return, still lurking, those women with their clipboards, monstrous specters waiting in the wings of a life I was too terrified to engage with. Fast forward to high school, I talked it over with friends after a movie about conspiracy theories. It was just a story, I told myself, a figment of some overactive childhood imagination, and yet when I stumbled upon their names on one of those online databases, the kind that promises to reveal secrets buried under layers of bureaucracy, a chill twisted in my gut. They were both renowned in the field of behavioral studies, specializing in life experimentation targeting gifted children. I eased back into my chair, the light of the screen illuminating their smiling faces, but I dwelled upon the chilling concept that their observations were part of an unending larger experiment. I hastily shut the laptop and pushed it aside, but the dark truth thrummed beneath the surface, unsettling, persistent, until nearly a week later when a package arrived at my doorstep. A standard envelope greeted me from an unknown sender, and as I tore it open, a small card slipped out, familiar handwriting sprawled across its surface. "You've been chosen again." A simplistic note followed by a single photograph staring back at me, the two women from my past, now smiling with a child I barely recognized, drawn in the same horrifying stick figure style I had found years before. How did they find me? I couldn't breathe, the rush of air strangling as if the grip of a hand were around my throat, a noose forged from nostalgia turned nightmarish. The realization settled like ice in my veins, casting all I once knew into a twisting abyss, leaving me with a single question: what would happen next? I have to tell you something that happened today, something I never thought would turn my entire life upside down in the span of just a few minutes, and believe me when I say it's going to sound insane, but I assure you it's true. Just 10 minutes ago, my dad found my pocket PC. Yeah, you heard that right, and let me explain before you judge, it's not what you think. I bought it a couple of weeks ago when I was feeling particularly lonely and curious about the whole thing, and I kept it hidden under a stack of old clothes in my closet, a place I thought was secure. Anyway, my dad, bless his heart, decided it was time to clean out the storage space in my room this morning. He's always been super practical, and he thinks that a clutter-free room equals a clutter-free mind. I was in the living room pretending to study because if I tried to stop him, I knew I'd have to admit I wasn't even working and that would mean more chores. So there I was, sweating bullets as I heard the telltale rustle of clothes being shifted around and then the unmistakable sound of plastic crinkling. That's when my heart started racing. It was only a matter of time before reality crashed down on me like an avalanche. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to remind him that sometimes it's better not to know. He wouldn't understand, or worse, he would judge me. But I just kept my mouth shut, too tortured by the anticipation. And then I heard it, the solid, resounding thump of the plastic hitting the floor. My stomach dropped, and I swear I could feel my heart pounding in my throat as the thought of him discovering it turned into a nightmare. I focused on the sound of the TV instead, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd dismiss it, thinking it was some weird toy or something left behind from when I was younger. But then, his footsteps started moving towards me, and my brain went into overdrive. Should I run? Should I pretend to be asleep? All I could think about was how he once told me that fathers should be a source of guidance and strength, not shame, but I felt so vulnerable at that moment. "Hey, come here for a second," he called out, his voice completely calm, and that only made my anxiety spike higher, wondering how on earth he could be so nonchalant about discovering his son's secret pleasure. I took a deep breath and stepped toward him, feeling like I was walking to my execution instead of just to the living room, and there he was, holding it in his massive hands like it was the strangest relic he'd ever found. "What's this?" he asked, and I could see it lying in the middle of the floor, glistening unnaturally yellow in the light, a horrifyingly intimate object that felt like a betrayal not just of my own privacy but of everything we'd ever shared. He didn't look angry, just bewildered, and I could only muster a weak, it's a toy." The embarrassment clawed at my throat, tightening like a noose as I tried to justify something that felt inherently unjustifiable. In that fleeting moment, all the thoughts of potential explanations ran through my mind. What would it even mean for him to know this side of me? But instead of outrage or disappointment, there was just this moment of awkward silence, a chasm opening between who I was, who I wanted to be, and who I knew he saw me as. "A toy for what?" he asked, eyes narrowing, not in judgment but in genuine confusion, and I swallowed hard, feeling the tears prick at the corners of my eyes as my body reacted to both shame and fear in their most primal forms. I was hyper-aware of everything around us, the old family photos watching silently from the wall, the clock ticking away the precious seconds, and the very air growing thick with unspilled feelings. 4. You know, when you're alone. I blurted out, my heart racing as the words escaped my lips, and I watched as his mouth fell open slightly in shock, and then something shifted in his gaze, not anger or judgment, but a kind of understanding, perhaps even empathy. You know, son, he said slowly, almost hesitantly, everyone has their ways of coping. I wasn't always this old and wise. It felt like the ground shifted beneath my feet, some kind of twisted normalization of the situation as he recounted awkward tales from his own youth, stumbling through the clumsiness of his teenage years in a way that reflected a shared humanity between us. It was still so surreal for me, the notion that he could ever relate to my experience in that way, but it also left me feeling exposed, like the last vestiges of my privacy had been stripped away. Just next time, keep it hidden better, he said, a half-smile tugging at his lips as I somehow felt a sense of belonging resurfacing despite the very awkwardness of the moment. It was bizarre, shooting back into my brain like a jolt of disbelief that this conversation could even be happening. But then, as the words hung between us and the initial shock wore off, I sensed an undeniable echo in the silence that loomed afterward, as though despite the understanding, a shadow had crept in, reminding me that not everything can be normalized. There's a fine line between acceptance and envision, and I couldn't shake the thought that something unspoken loomed overhead now, like a dark cloud. What else about me might he find if he kept digging? What else had I left behind in the nooks and crannies of my life that could compel him to look deeper? And just like that, my mind spiraled into the terrain of paranoia, nurturing the seeds of worry that despite the light-hearted banner, I could never completely escape the judgment, or worse, the betrayal lurking just beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. 10 minutes had changed everything, torn apart the fabric of a simple father-son relationship and opened up a chasm of uncertainty. And just when I thought that maybe we could laugh this off and go back to the usual domestic grind, I realized I didn't even know how to face him now, how to reconcile the intimacy of that moment with my own vulnerability, and as I turned to escape the heavy burden of the room, I was left with an echo of something deeper, an unsettling reminder that no matter how light he intended to make it, I'd never look at that pocket PC the same way again, or my dad, or any part of my life that, for the first time, seemed irrevocably intertwined with secrets I could never shake off, leaving me to wonder how many more hidden things lay dormant in my existence, waiting to be brought into the light, as everything I thought I knew began to unravel, one uncomfortable revelation at a time. It was a blistering summer day when my friends convinced me to join them at the river for what they described as the quintessential teenage adventure, inner tubing down the winding, sun-kissed waters. My parents were out of town, and I figured, what the hell, right? Besides, trust my friends, especially Derek and Carla, they promised it was going to be epic. So, I threw on my swimsuit, packed a cooler full of sodas, and headed out, laughing and joking as we piled into Derek's car like a bunch of thrill-seeking idiots. The river was picturesque, shimmering sun, lush trees bending over the edges, the water flowing with that gentle, inviting burble that screamed fun. We inflated our tubes right on the shore, children of the wild, ready to conquer the river like a ragtag army. The first hour was pure bliss, floating down, shouting, splashing water on each other, and reminiscing about childhood memories. We drifted lazily, sunburns starting to peek at our exposed skin, until I felt it, the unmistakable pressure in my stomach that could only mean one thing. I should have known better. I had eaten way too many snacks back at Derek's house, but now I was out here, miles down the river with no restroom in sight, feeling the impending doom of the worst kind of discomfort. I casually drifted a bit behind, trying to make light of it with humor, but my laughter was swallowed by the sound of rushing water and what felt like impending disaster. I considered my options, paddle to the shore and hope to find a bathroom, or just ride it out. Deep down, I knew it'd be a bad idea. Yet, with every passing moment, the pressure mounted, and I was painfully aware of the stares my friends were throwing at me, their laughter ringing hollow against my anxious mind. Just then, the river plunged into a small rapids, and as I gasped and whooped with adrenaline, the pressure in my gut screamed, and I knew I had to make a decision. Wisdom would have said to let it be, that no one would ever find out. But with one last surge of courage, and maybe a tad bit of madness, I naively thought I could manage both the thrill of the rapids and the growing urgency twisting my insides. It couldn't be that bad, right? As we slipped over the edge of the rapids, my fear clouded my judgment, and I lost the battle. The second I hit the calm part of the river again, I felt it release, more of an explosion than a trickle, and in that instant, I realized I'd just done the absolute unthinkable. I felt wretched, frozen in time, caught between sinking into the abyss of humiliation and acceptance. The water didn't care, just another way to taint the purity of its flow. Oh God, I looked around, panicked, and all I could see were my friends blissfully floating away, seemingly unaware of my internal meltdown. Carla caught my eye, a playful grin painted across her sun-kissed face, and I felt a chill run through me. I knew she would eventually smell it. My heart raced faster than I could paddle, trying to make myself look unbothered, but it's impossible to carry such a secret in the open air, when every breeze seems to whisper shame. A minute felt like an eternity as I prayed for the winds to shift and my friends to forget I was alive, and for a fleeting moment, they were blissfully unaware, their voices filled with laughter, until Derek suddenly paused, his nose wrinkling, and just like that, the laughter faded into an uneasy silence. "Oh, what the hell is that?" he shouted, looking at me with a mix of confusion and disgust. I watched as his expression morphed into dread. He knew. Carla turned her head, her grin melting into horror, and I felt the eyes of the world pin me to that moment forever like a haunting flashcard. The laughter disintegrated, replaced by gasps of understood betrayal. They had my number, and God help me, I was trapped. The water wrapped around me like a noose, suffocating, as horror spread among us like a contagious plague. I wanted a black hole to swallow me up, to cease to exist where I was ensnared in the stifling silence, no one wanting to breach the profound act of what had just transpired. Derek made a gagging sound and tried to steer his tube away from me, suddenly laughing, but it was hollow and bitter. I could hear it choke against his throat. "Dude, are you serious?" Carla's voice was piercing and laced with disbelief. Their laughter turned sharp, accusatory, like arrows aiming straight for my heart, every single word a reminder of my fall from grace. "You can't be serious," Derek repeated like a mantra through laughter mixed with horror, yet the moment felt too heavy to bear. I felt the world shifting beneath me, friendships teetering on the edge of collapse, while I, the warrior of shame, faced the consequences of lax judgment and urgency. The river felt like an executioner's platform, my laughter a distant memory, lost in the strum of nature's cruel symphony. The rest of the ride home was a tumult of emotions. They mocked me gently at first, but the laughter quickly turned into vicious teasing. I could no longer keep my head held high. Instead, I wanted to sink as low as possible under the waters of the current. Every splash they made felt like a calculated attack on what's left of my dignity, and I swore that day they were nothing but sharks, circling my pathetic, exposed soul. By the time we reached the shore, the laughter had dulled to mere echoes of what had happened, haunting for years on, as the memory carved itself ever so deeply into my existence. I'd hoped it would fade, that maybe, just maybe, it would become just another funny story to tell, an absurdity shared later in life. But I learned quickly that some traumas are too profound, too intimate, meant to be buried deep beneath the surface as I became the punchline in our circle, a shadow of mockery. To this day, the smell of chlorine and river water pulls me back to that fateful afternoon, the laughter of my so-called friends, and the way I unceremoniously mutilated my youth with a choice that would follow me forever. I stride through life now with a weight that can't be shed, a darkness rooted in those ephemeral moments of childish recklessness, and as I sit here and type this, my heart races, wondering if the guilt of that day will ever truly wash away. For weeks, I had watched Greg, our flashy co-worker, slip into the dimly lit bathroom beneath the fluorescent buzz of the office lights, only to emerge moments later, his demeanor disheveled, and his eyes glazed over, a shadow of their former self. It started when I overheard him mumbling to himself during a meeting, and while I brushed it off at first, the unsettling scent of stale cigarettes and something sweetly sickly wafting through the air during our lunch breaks couldn't be ignored, and with each passing day, my concern morphed into a gnawing suspicion that he was drowning his anxiety in more than just caffeine, leading me to one fateful day when the stress of deadlines and uncomfortable interactions coalesced into a moment of reckless courage, pushing me to scribble a note that ominously read, "I saw Greg snorting Xanax in the bathroom and leaving it on my boss's computer." The thrill of uncertainty mingling with guilt as I left the office for the day, convinced that I was doing the right thing, protecting my colleagues and preserving the office's integrity. The following morning, I returned to a charged atmosphere, whispers electrifying the air, and the uneasy tension in the break room made me feel as if everyone's eyes were drawn to me, yet paradoxically, none of them seemed to notice the absence of Greg, who was unceremoniously terminated last night, or so I was told. The details were murky at best, but it became painfully evident that the note had reached the right hands and precipitated a swift downfall. His pathetic excuse for an explanation lost between hushed giggles and nervous glances among my co-workers, their laughter sharp enough to cut through my anxiety, and still I couldn't shake the feeling that I had triggered something much darker than I intended. As I replayed my decision over and over in my mind like a haunting melody, what if Greg wasn't just snorting Xanax? What if it was worse? The tremors of guilt gnawed at my insides, turning the office into a stage set for a terrible crime, and that sense was only deepened when I witnessed Lisa, his closest confidant, her face pale, almost as if the very essence of joy had leaked out of her during the chaos, approached me in the copy room, her eyes wide with sleepless fright. She lowered her voice, the tremor in her hands shaking the paper she clutched, a half-written apology to Greg scrawled in a hurried script. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered, leaving me cold, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as I questioned her allegiance and intentions, each word wrapping itself around my mind like a noose. Days turned into nights, and while the office buzz continued, Greg's absence grew heavier, thicker, like a fog strangling the very air, and at noon, I noticed Lisa arguing with her boss in hushed, frantic whispers, pointing fingers with expressions that mirrored horror more than anger, but it was her expression that struck a chord in my gut, the real fear radiating off of her like heat from a fire. Something elsewhere in our building had gone off course, and even though pieces of the puzzle scattered across my mind didn't seem to form a picture, they would remain there, spiraling into dark thoughts until the day I got home and found a mangled note slipped through my door saying, "You have no idea what you've done," scrawled in Greg's handwriting. My heart fell, terror and regret intertwined like roots from a twisted, ancient tree, and as night fell and sleep evaded me, I stared at the ceiling wondering who else had known, who else had seen Mark's deepening darkness in the bathroom. The whispers to each other now morphing into something sinister, paranoia locking doors inside my mind, then driving out to find comfort in any possible way. I found myself reaching out to a friend, only to realize the stakes were far too high, the entanglement of betrayal and ignorance stretched infinitely, every phone call seemed compromised, every interaction tinged with a silent undertow of danger, and reality itself began to feel skewed, a mirage flickering at the corners of my vision. Before you know it, I was awake every night, the insidious thoughts taking root, convinced that Greg was watching me, a specter haunting my cubicle, lying in wait for the perfect opportunity to strike back, twisting the narrative so skillfully that even I doubted my own intentions, once so solid, now drowned in uncertainty. And then, one fateful evening, as I departed late from the office in a haze of fatigue, I felt the prickle of eyes on my back, a familiar shiver that sent shudders through my body, making my dinner lurch, only to find Greg standing in the shadows between cars, a smirk twisting his lips, hidden beneath the fluorescent glow of the streetlights, his presence slithering into my nightmares. "You think you can ruin me?" he whispered, stepping into the light just enough for me to see the depthless darkness behind his eyes, and it was in that moment, dear reader, that I felt the cold hand of regret wrap around my throat, because I had thought I had done something good when, in reality, I had unleashed a storm I would never survive. And now, all I can say is that if you ever feel compelled to right a wrong, just remember, the consequences might not just come for you, but for everyone you love, and sometimes the monsters you create are far worse than the ones you thought you were saving others from. When I was a teenager, I stumbled into the world of chat lines, those late-night calls where strangers shared their darkest secrets and desires, a playground of anonymity where I could pretend to be anyone I wanted. I even played the role of an underage girl, feigning innocence, letting the sounds of men's voices wash over me, enticing whispers that pulled me into a web of deception I thought I could control. But it got out of hand one fateful night when I found myself on the line with a man whose voice dripped with unsettling charm. Claiming to be a fatherly figure who understood my struggles, I caught a thrill when he said he could save me from my lonely existence. An odd sense of comfort wrapped itself around me as I played along, feeding him bits of my fabricated life while ignoring the red flags waving frantically in the back of my mind. He wanted to meet, and with each escalating thrill, a twist pulled tighter in my gut. A sensation I ignored as I stirred deeper into this dark fantasy, thinking I was just playing a game, but I agreed, my heart pounding, and not just from thrill but terror that began to stir when he told me he knew where I lived. I laughed it off, insisting he was bluffing, but he calmly replied, "You think I can't find you? Just keep talking, and I'll show you what I can do." And with that, the playful charade turned sinister, twisting my thoughts, burying my bravado under the weight of an undeniable fear that blossomed like a dark flower, blackening the innocence I thought I was preserving, recalling every creepy detail from the stories I'd heard about girls who foolishly put themselves in harm's way. The clock ticked, my heart raced, and I began to question every choice I had ever made in my reckless pursuit of attention. I said nothing, becoming a silent statue on the line, waiting for his voice to call again, praying this was all a sick joke, but returning calls echoed against the walls of my mind, escalating the dread I felt. Out of desperation, I hung up and buried myself in distraction, scrolling through social media, hoping to shove this experience into a far corner of my mind, telling myself I was safe, I was clever, but days turned into weeks and that thrill turned into a haunting echo that deepened my growing sense of paranoia. Then, one ominous evening as I walked home from my friend's house, feeling the chill of dusk settling in, I heard it, the low inflection of a voice crackling through the air, murky and familiar, causing an icy shiver that crawled through my spine, making every hair on my body stand at attention. It mirrored the tones of my late-night conversations, threading its way through the dark like a living shadow chasing me. I turned to find nothing but an empty street, until I saw it, a figure lurking at a distance, draped in the twilight shadows. The heart in my chest thudded violently as the reality of just how vulnerable I had made myself settled in. That feeling of being followed clamped down on me tight as I tried to convince myself I was simply being foolish, but I couldn't shake the urge to turn around, to observe as I began walking briskly, my instincts screaming at me to run. When I reached my doorstep, I slammed the door shut, leaned against it, gasping for breath, and the brief sense of security washed over me, yet I couldn't calm the raging storm inside. My cell phone buzzed unexpectedly in my pocket, and when I fished it out, there it was, a message from a blocked number reading simply, "You shouldn't play games you can't win." And in that moment, the laughter of my youthful naivety turned to ash in my mouth as pure dread settled over me, swirling into my consciousness. I realized how foolish I was to think I could dance on the edge without ever falling, and with trembling hands, I deleted my account and swore never to return to those lines again. But what I thought was the end of this dark chapter was just the beginning. Because the next morning, the familiar creep of dread sank its claws deeper into my gut when I found handwritten notes slipped under my door, with details only I would know, recounting snippets of my life that should have remained private, my school, my friends, the secrets I shared with no one. The notes continued for weeks, growing more intense, more threatening, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was the product of overactive imagination, my gut growled with a chilling certainty that someone was watching, waiting, calculating. I turned to the police, who looked at me as if I were just another teenager seeking attention, and despair enveloped me until one night, I finally snapped. I decided to confront my shadow. I sent a text from a fake number, filled with passive aggression, taunting this phantom that haunted my steps, asking who they were, as if I could somehow lure a response and unveil my stalker's identity. It worked, fueling the fire inside the heart of this unknown monster because within hours I received a reply, chilling yet captivating, a single word, "Soon." And in an instant, a sizzling temperature ignited in my chest, coursing through my veins, fear morphing into an insatiable thrill. I stood outside on my porch, dialed that chat line number one last time, my breath hitching as the call connected, and while my pulse raced in excitement, the voice that slithered through the phone sent shivers down my spine. It was him, the man I had spoken to all those years ago, and he asked me if I had enjoyed our little game, if I liked the new rules. I didn't know if this was a nightmare or if I was going completely insane, but when faced with the cold reality that the monster I had invited into my life was very real and breathing just outside my window, each breath pressed against my throat, a new level of terror emerged within me, blending seamlessly into the darkness of the laugh echoing back at me through the receiver. A sound so utterly bone-chilling that I realized too late, some games can indeed be played to the end, but the stakes may be far more than you bargained for. Each turn pushing the boundaries of survival and sanity at the same time, casting shadows where once there had only been a fleeting thrill, only for me to discover that the deeper you dive into someone else's darkness, the more your own shadows come to haunt you. I have major daddy issues that molded me into who I am today, and it all started the summer I turned 11. That's when my father, a jovial man with a bellowing laugh and an unapologetically booming personality, vanished from my life without warning, leaving only a note that felt more like a sinister riddle than a farewell. Find me in the shadows. My mother, fragile and devoid of her former brightness, became a ghost in our house, her silence speaking volumes about her heartbreak and my insatiable curiosity. I spent the next few weeks searching for answers in every crevice of our old Victorian home, the attic where I discovered a wrapped shoebox filled with my father's belongings, Polaroids of him with strangers, cryptic letters, and a worn-out pocket watch that ticked off the seconds like they were taunting my insecurities. It felt as if those remnants had been imbued with an aura of guilt and dread. I convinced myself that he wasn't dead but rather lost among the shadows, waiting for the day I would find him. I grew up chasing ghosts, eyes darting down dark alleys and desolate corners where light barely touched, certain that if I just looked hard enough, I'd uncover the truth behind his departure. Each failed attempt deepened the wound, And as adolescence hit me hard with a rush of insecurities, I turned to unhealthy relationships, starving for validation wherever I could find it. The first boy who told me I was beautiful became my world, but when he ghosted me like my father had, I hollowed out even further, my heart breaking each time another guy tried to earn my trust only to shatter it like fine porcelain. The summer after high school ended, as I was desperately trying to forge a new identity from the shards of my past, I made a pact with a friend to attend a party at an abandoned warehouse, where the rumor was that ghosts lingered, the kind that spoke of lost loves and unresolved familial issues. I brushed off the idea as ridiculous, but with a drink in my hand and traces of freedom on my lips, I followed a group into those hallowed halls where the music pulsed like a living entity, and the air throbbed with unexplainable tension. It was there, beneath flickering lights and haunting whispers, that I met him, a charismatic stranger who seemed to see straight into my fractured soul. He introduced himself simply as Jake, with eyes that glinted with a familiar mischief, his smile laced with secrets that drew me in like a moth to flame. He never asked about my past, instead, he listened to my nightmarish stories as if he were savoring each word, pulling me deeper into an intoxicating spiral of laughter and shared secrets. Yet, the more I opened up about my father's disappearance, the more Jake seemed unsettled, his gaze flitting to the darkness just beyond the reach of light. One night, while we wandered through abandoned neighborhoods, I impulsively suggested we hunt for ghosts, half seriously hoping to catch a glimpse of my dad. Jake smiled, albeit with a tinge of hesitation, and led me to a desolate park where the moon cast eerie shadows among the trees, the chilling silence blanketing us like an ominous presence waiting to be awakened. As Jake recounted tales of lost spirits, I felt an unexpected surge of hope, convinced that this would be the night I'd confront my past and find my dad. Hours slipped away like sand through our fingers, and just as the clock struck midnight, the air turned ice cold. The dark branches seemed to sway like skeletal fingers beckoning us closer, and for the first time, I felt the weight of expectation on my shoulders. "What if he's right there, watching you?" Jake whispered, his voice sending shivers down my spine. I spun around, half expecting my father to emerge from the shadows, but instead, it was a spectral vision, my father, looking every bit the same as I remembered, except his empty eyes were now gunmetal gray, filled with a mix of meaning and torment. I trembled, my heart pounding against my ribs as I reached out for him, but the air around me thickened with an unfathomable dread. Jake's expression shifted from admiration to fear, and before I could comprehend what was happening, he screamed for me to run. I felt the darkness surge, twisting and pulling at my sanity, and I bolted back through the park while the looming figure of my father faded further into the shadows, an unfulfilled promise lingering in the air. In the days that followed, I spiraled into a pit of despair, questioning everything and everyone. Jake, who had seemed to understand me so well, became another ghost. It was only later, when I came across the very pocket watch from the attic at a garage sale, that the horror unfolded. Its broken chime rang through my mind as if awakening memories buried deep. Every tick became a reminder of my father's absence, dragging forth the realization that the truth lay not in the shadows of my childhood but in the reflection of the man I had compromised myself to be. I never saw Jake again, not in this world or the next, but his words echoed in my mind like a haunting whisper, reminding me that my daddy issues were not just about abandonment, they were about the shadows I carried, shaping me into someone who searched for love in all the wrong places. It's been years, but I'm still haunted, forever trapped in a cycle of seeking those familiar patterns, the echoes of my father's laughter, and the lingering question, will I ever be enough for someone to stay? I never thought putting itching powder in my roommate's fleshlight would lead to anything more than a harmless prank, but I should have known better, the moment I ripped open that Ziploc bag and sprinkled the powder into the soft, inviting interior. A sense of dread wriggled through me like a dormant cockroach waking up under the fridge. My roommate, Jordan, was one of those guys with a twisted sense of humor. Hell, I should have expected some kind of retaliation, but when you're in college, it's all about pushing boundaries, and boy, did I push it this time. The plan was simple, let him discover the powder mid-pleasure so we could both have a good laugh at how ridiculous he'd be scrambling for relief, but that evening as I watched him enter his room, I felt a twinge of guilt pull at my stomach. That guilt didn't last long. The next day, as I lounged on the couch, the sound of Jordan's frantic banging on the bathroom walls echoed through our apartment. "Derek. You've got to help me. Something's wrong." Panic rippled through my veins, knitting a frown onto my face. I couldn't help but laugh, the thought of him struggling with the itching powder made me feel like a mischievous god. I sauntered over, peering through the bathroom door, and there he was, bathed in a sheen of sweat, his eyes wild with a desperation I'd never seen before. "It burns, man. It's burning," he yelled, and at that moment I realized he wasn't joking. This was something more than just a prank gone too far. A sense of foreboding landed heavy on my shoulders as he slammed the door open, nearly knocking me backward. The horror on his face was tangible, raw, no joke about it. "I can't take it. It's everywhere." His skin was flushed and blotchy, and I couldn't help but entertain the question of how he must have used that fleshlight to be so utterly consumed by a minor prank. It should have ended there, should have been dismissed as harmless fun, but soon enough, the laughter turned hollow as Jordan's fingers began to twitch, his body radiating an alarming frenzy. He paced the room, murmuring incoherently about something that wasn't right. Hours passed and the itching didn't stop, it only morphed into crawling sensations, like tiny ants racing under his skin. I realized this wasn't sheer mischief anymore, it felt darker, more sinister, like I had unleashed something I couldn't contain. "Derek, I need to go to the hospital," he blurted out, panic-stricken. Something deep inside warned me not to let him leave. I knew if he did, he might trace it back to me and punish me in ways I couldn't fathom. Instead, I pried open the creaky door and begged him to wait, to let me figure it out, so he wouldn't freak out even more. But everything I suggested was met with wild-eyed skepticism. I rummaged through my mind for any knowledge on remedies, scouring my memory for the slightest hint of what might help. Finally, I suggested a cold shower, anything to numb the incessant sensation. The moment he stepped into that icy cascade, I prayed it was the miracle cure, but then I heard his screams, unearthly shrieks of terror that pierced the walls, reverberating like those screams I had read about in horror stories. I rushed to the bathroom, and when I opened the door, a nightmarish sight awaited me. Jordan, half crouched on the shower floor, scratching frantically at his skin, his nails drawing red welts like brushstrokes on a canvas. "It won't stop," he howled, and that's when I saw it, a dreadful sight, thin, black veins webbing across his arms, pulsing and thumping like they had lives of their own, almost as if the powder had consumed him, had burrowed into his body. I staggered back, horrified at the transformation happening before my very eyes, and he locked his gaze on me, a gaze that sent chills racing down my spine. "I can feel it in my veins, Derek. Something's waking up inside me." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was just going overboard with a prank gone wrong, but I couldn't. I stood there, frozen in place, as he backed away slowly, the last glimmer of humor extinguished, leaving only fear and regret. With every trembling breath, I stumbled back, his cries mingling with the frantic water cascading down the shower walls, each drop echoing doom. I had done this, my prank had taken on a life of its own, as if the universe had conspired against me for my carelessness. I quickly fled the bathroom, panic coursing through me, colliding with the nauseating reality that I was responsible for unleashing something dreadful onto my roommate. "You have to help me," he cried, but how could I? What could I possibly do? It felt like I was playing with fire and now it was spreading beyond my reach. I raced to my room, locking the door behind me, my heart thundering in my chest as I replayed the events that had spiraled out of control. Night fell, and the darkness hugged my nerves tightly, sitting heavy like a thick cloak. Through the walls, I could hear Jordan, howling as if in the grip of some unseen torment. Each cry was a knife to my conscience, a reminder of the cruel seeds I had sown. The scratching sounds grew louder, punctuated by the sickening squelch of someone, trapped in agony beyond my doorway. In that moment, I decided I had to finish this. I had to turn back time and unearth a solution like a bolt of lightning cracking the sky open. But as I gathered my courage and stepped from my room, the second I glanced down the hallway, I froze. The bathroom door stood ajar, and though I willed myself to move forward, I was paralyzed, racked with the chilling thought that whatever I expected to find, it was beyond anything my imagination could conjure. As I slowly approached the bathroom, the air clawed at my throat, hanging heavy with tension, each creak of the floorboards beneath me echoed ominously. I peered around the corner, and when I did, my stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. The shower still ran, windows fogged with steam. But it was far too quiet now. An uneasy silence danced in the air, and there, in the middle of the shower, I saw Jordan's reflection staring back at me, only it wasn't his face anymore, it had twisted into something grotesque and chilling. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunken into his skull, and where the veins had once pulsed now writhed black tendrils that seemed to stretch out, scratching at the porcelain like spiders. "Derek," he murmured, but it wasn't his voice, it was something deeper, a haunting, echoing call that made my insides churn. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I stood glued to the spot, and when it hit me, what I had awakened inside him, The reality crushed me like a wave crashing against the shore. "Get out!" he wailed, and in that moment, a surge of unbearable pain shot through the air, carrying with it the weight of my regret. I turned and ran for my life, ignoring the way fear clenched at my chest, fueling every step out of that apartment, knowing I might have released something far worse than a mere prank, and someone else would have to deal with what I had done. As I fled into the night, I couldn't shake the whispering doubt that somewhere in the darkness, Jordan was no longer just my roommate, he was something I could never fully understand, a horror born of my own making, and I knew there was no escaping the consequences of the itch I had awakened. I woke up today with a heavy chest, the kind of weight that sits on you like a bad dream refusing to fade, and I knew it was the day I had finally decided to take action, an end to the pain that had become my life. I lived in a constant haze of despair, marked by the spiral of isolation and anxiety that had consumed me over the past few months, painted in shades of gray that dulled the edges of everything I used to love. At my lowest, I sketched it all out in my mind, an escape plan that had taken shape in the bleak recesses of my thoughts. I spent the day preparing, gathering items that would make this shadowy decision a simpler affair, a rope hidden in the garage, a few well-placed notes for my family that I hoped would convey my love amidst my departure. I didn't want any grand send-off, I only desired a quiet end to my struggle, something serene, beautiful even, like the closure of a book you couldn't put down because it hurt too much to read. My close friend, Jacob, texted me that morning, completely unaware of my plans, inviting me to one of his late-night sonatas that I had skipped countless times before. I almost laughed at how normal everything felt, my heart aching with unfulfilled longing to simply say yes and join him, but I quickly silenced the thought. Instead, I prepared myself for the night ahead, making sure to plot a route that would lead me straight back home after I said my goodbyes. There was a tension in the air as evening fell, an electricity that pulsed through me, intertwining with fear and a sickening sense of relief. When I arrived at Jacob's house, surrounded by the flicker of candlelight and hushed laughter, his eyes lit up as he embraced me tightly, pulling me into the warmth of his company, even as I felt myself slipping further away into the dark corners of my mind. The music floated like a haunting melody, sometimes soothing, sometimes unsettling, and I lost myself in thought, imagining what would happen as soon as I left the gathering. Jacob played beautifully, pouring his heart into the instrument that had woven so many memories for us, each note resting heavy in the air, laden with unsaid words. I felt the pulse of something within me, a wavering heartbeat of hope rising up just as quickly as my resolve crumbled, and I knew then that I had to leave without him ever knowing. But just as I stood to slip away, I heard him call my name, a simple word that shattered my carefully crafted facade. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etching itself onto his face, and I forced a smile, telling him about the usual stresses of life, pretending the weight on my chest didn't threaten to crush me. Jacob stared into my eyes as if searching for answers I couldn't give him, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding in his gaze, as if he knew more than I had let on. I didn't want to burden him with my demons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was more aware of my darkness than I realized. After a while, he pulled me aside, away from the lively banter of our friends, and shared a story, one he said had changed his perspective on life. It was about hope, resilience, and the simple fact that when someone is in despair, a single person can spark a series of events that alters their fate completely. The words wrapped around me, squeezing the air from my lungs, as I felt the duality of my decision weigh against the importance of his message. Just then, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat, a cosmic joke, a signal from the universe that I had yet to grasp fully. My mind skittered back to my plans, and with each passing second, I felt the binds of my resolve loosening under the weight of his sincerity. When the lights returned, I caught a glimpse of something almost imperceptible within Jacob's eyes, a glimmer of intuition that set my skin alight and kindled a hesitant flame of connection I thought lost, an understanding beyond the surface. It broke something in me, and suddenly, I couldn't think about slipping away, because he had wrenched me back from the edge just by being there, without even knowing it. I didn't tell him about my thoughts of escape, perhaps I didn't need to. The truth was, I'd been standing on the precipice, peering into an abyss that whispered promises of peace, and he had somehow illuminated the darker paths with his presence. By the end of the night, I made a promise to myself, to reach out, to talk more, to still the whisperings of despair that loomed so constantly in my life. As we parted ways, Jacob smiled and hugged me again. But this time it felt different. This time, as I looked into his eyes, I realized that maybe I was worth saving. I didn't know how deep the shadow went, or if I'd ever fully escape, but with friends like him, maybe I wouldn't have to fight the darkness alone anymore. Later that night, lying in bed, I could feel the old weight still hanging around, but somehow it felt lighter, like a burden shared rather than one I carried alone. I drifted into sleep with a flicker of something resembling hope, not knowing that every note of love and joy wrapped in those melodies had silently crept into the corners of my heart, saving me from what could have been my final attempt today. As a kid, I always loved my little brother, Ben, more than anything else in the world. He had this sweet, innocent smile and a giggle that could light up a dark room, but bedtime was always a chore for him. Every night he was terrified of the dark, of shadows lurking in the corners, and I would always let him crawl into bed with me just to soothe him. But soon, a strange dynamic began to form, as he started sleeping more and more in my bed while our parents were unaware, believing I was being a good big brother and watching out for him. But deep down, I wasn't just comforting him. There were whispers every night that crawled under my skin, whispers that only Ben seemed to hear, and it started innocently enough with him waking me up in the middle of the night, eyes wide and trembling, convinced he saw something by the window or a sinister shape in the corner of the room. He would point, and I'd assure him there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows, and I'd pull him close, his tiny body shaking against mine as I told him stories about brave knights and daring dragons to drown out the echoes of whatever haunted him. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, gnawing at my nerves, until one fateful night when Ben sat up abruptly and stared wide-eyed into the midnight darkness, his little voice trembling as he said with an eerie certainty that there was a man standing at the foot of my bed. My heart dropped. I bolted upright, flipping on the lamp, scanning the room, but there was nothing, just the hollow silence of our old house. I tried to pass it off as a dream or an imagined fear, but as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the hairs on my neck prickling with unease, so I wrapped an arm around my brother, feeling his breathing steady against my side, hoping to calm him and myself. But no matter how much I told myself it was all in his head, the truth was that something was very wrong, and that wrongness was growing. Over the next few weeks, the nightmares escalated, with Ben waking me nightly, talking about the man, his description twisted and bleak. He had no face, just a gaping void where features ought to be, and his voice was something we could never hear, yet it echoed in the back of our minds like a heavy bell tolling in a distant land. And while I dismissed his fears at first, laughing as if it was all part of childhood imagination, I couldn't ignore the impact it had on him. He was losing weight, his eyes growing dark and sunken, and I started to become terrified for him. But every time I questioned him about it, he only told me that the man wanted him to go with him, and that night, I made a decision. I would take charge and protect my brother, so I devised a plan to stay vigilant, to keep Ben close and ward off whatever darkness loomed over him. But that night, I did something I never thought I would. I fell asleep. The warmth of my brother sprawling across my side felt like safety. But I woke. With a start to silence, everything was eerily still as I reached out to find Ben. He was gone. Panic set in as I jumped off the bed, rushing to his room, tossing on the light, but it was empty. My heart raced as I circled the house, calling out for him frantically until I finally found him in the living room, staring blankly toward the hatch to the attic. My gut churned as I approached him, noticing the way he stood rigid, eyes glowing with a strange light, and when I called his name, he turned. But it wasn't my brother looking back at me. There was a hollow emptiness in his features, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, just a cruel imitation of the Ben I knew, and my heart dropped as he said in an oddly distanced voice, "He told me I could come play," before he abruptly turned and began to crawl toward the attic door, and I grasped his arm, desperation clawing at my throat, pulling him toward me. But as I did, a cold wind swept through the room, and the whispers danced around us like a chilling dance, tearing through my sanity. And as Ben's grip loosened, I realized with horror that he was listening to it, drawn like a moth to a flame, and I could feel the air shifting as a darker presence enveloped us, pressing against my chest, urging me to let go, to succumb to whatever promised my brother sweet dreams and dark fantasies. But it was a lie, I knew that. I yanked him back into my arms, as tight as I could, begging him to remember who he was, who we were, but the look in his eyes was one of dull acceptance, and in that moment, I felt the last of his warmth slip away, snatched by something beyond my comprehension, and the next thing I knew, his tiny body was gone, dissolved like mist into the gathering shadows, leaving me alone standing in the grip of whatever nightmare had claimed him, its smothering presence wrapping around me, pulling me into darkness. And as I stood there, shivering in the heaving silence of the house, I understood too late that I had failed him. My little brother, the one I'd promised to protect, had traded me for something far worse, and as the shadows danced ever closer, I realized there was a reason he had been terrified of the dark, a reason he needed my bed. It was never just about fear, it was about something lurking that fed off that fear, something that made it feel safe to lead him away, and as realization washed over me, I turned, looking up at the attic, knowing there was no choice left. There was only one way to save my brother now, one horrifying truth waiting for me to confront. But deep down I also knew that whatever I faced up there would change me forever, and as I took that first step up the creaky stairs, a whisper followed, coiling around my mind like smoke, saying, "Join us."